This is the story of the Great Lakes by Edward Channing and Marion Florence Lansing, narrated by Right Here Audio. Part 2, The Struggle for Possession. Chapter 8, The Founding of Detroit. After the failure, which had been recounted in the preceding chapter, Le Barre was recalled to France and a new governor, Denonville, sent over to take his place. He had not much greater success and was in turn replaced by Count Frontenac, who returned to the scene of his former labors. This was in 1689, when England and France were at war. For the remaining 9 years of his life, Frontenac devoted all his energies to defending New France against the English and the Iroquois, and to holding what the French had already gained on the Great Lakes. In November 1698, in his 78th year, he died and was deeply mourned as a strong governor and beloved leader. He had come out to New France in 1672, and during his long term of service, he had used his power and influence not only to build up the settlements on the St. Lawrence, but also to plant on the shores of the Great Lakes and the rivers beyond a line of French forts and trading posts. He had gathered about him a group of young men who shared his enthusiasm for expansion and were eager to carry on his work. 5 years before his death, Frontenac had sent one of his men, Cadillac, to the Straits of Mackinac to hold that center of the fur trade. Cadillac was a rough, forceful soldier who was summary in his methods and short in his speech. He was well suited to the command of a frontier post and did good work in keeping the Lake Indians from alliance with the enemies of the French. He did not, however, get on well with the missionaries at Michilimackinac. They resented his presence and his influence with the Indians, for whose conversion to Christianity they were earnestly laboring. Cadillac soon came to see that Detroit, and not Mackinac, was the key to the interior. Whoever held the narrow channel connecting Lake Erie and Lake Huron would control the fur trade of the whole lake region. He hastened to Quebec to gain support for his scheme of erecting a fort and trading station on the Detroit River. There he was stoutly opposed by the Jesuits, who foresaw that the carrying out of his project would mean the ruin of their mission, which could not compete commercially with the new station, and that the extension of trade would bring the vices of civilization to the natives. Nothing daunted, Cadillac went over the seas to France, gained the favor of the colonial minister, and returned to Canada with permission to found his colony. He reached Detroit with a band of 100 colonists and soldiers on the 24th of July, 1701. Cadillac had done well in choosing Detroit as the situation for the first permanent colony on the lakes. In the century that was past, the Great Lakes had been discovered and explored. The 18th century was to witness their occupation and the contest for the possession of this rich country. In this long strife, first France and England, and then England and the American colonies were to come to blows, while away on these shores unceasing warfare would be waged between the advancing white man and the retreating red man. In the opening years of the new century, Cadillac was taking the first step in permanent occupation of the country, planting his settlement on a site so important that a wise English leader was at that very time urging upon the New York Assembly its colonization by the English. So long as Lake Erie and Lake Ontario had been avoided by the French, the northern Ottawa River Georgian Bay route had been the highway of travel and trade. The easier southern route was now open to the French, but it was even more convenient and accessible to their English rivals. The French were brought face to face with the problem of how to hold the trade of the upper lakes from the English. In the solution of this problem, Detroit would be the key. There rushes through the Strait of Detroit more water than through any other river in the world, save only the Niagara and the St. Lawrence. Through this channel, whose average width is a mile and whose length is only 27 miles, pour in a steady, even current, unbroken by rapids or eddies, and with a speed of over 2 miles an hour, the waters of 3 lakes, Superior, Michigan, and Huron, and of the hundreds of streams that feed them. This little river is the natural outlet of 82,000 square miles of lake surface and 125,000 square miles of land. Down the swift current floated in those early days scores of canoes paddled by silent Indians and swarthy coureurs de bois, bearing to the markets at Montreal, Quebec, and Albany loads of beaver, mink, and otter fur of immense value. They were the forerunners of a tonnage passage through that strait which today exceeds that of the Thames and London. Cadillac and his soldiers and settlers, 50 each, had paddled, pushed, and carried their canoes, heavily laden with provisions, tools, ammunition, and supplies, all the way from Montreal. As they gazed on the beautiful sight of their future homes, their weariness passed away. With shouts of joy, they drew their canoes to the bank and unpacked their heavy loads for the last time. No exploring party had ever passed through the Detroit River without longing to stop. To appreciate the charm and wealth of that spot, one must read the vivid descriptions which were written by men of that time. Such an enthusiast was Cadillac. 2 months after his arrival, he wrote home the following, which would do credit to a promoter's prospectus of the present day. "The business of war being so different from that of writing," he said, "I have not the ability to make a portrait of a country so worth of a better pen than mine, but since you had directed me to render an account of it, I will do so." He described the river and then continued, "Its borders are so many vast prairies, and the freshness of the beauty waters keeps the banks always green. The prairies are bordered by long and broad rows of fruit trees, which have never felt the hand of the vigilant gardener. Here also orchards, young and old, soften and bend by their branches, under the weight and quantity of their fruit, towards the mother earth which has produced them. It is in this land so fertile that the ambitious vine, which is never wept under the knife of the vine-dresser, builds a thick roof with its large leaves and heavy clusters, weighing down the top of the tree which receives it, and often stifling it with its embrace. Under these broad walks one sees assembled by hundred the timid deer and fawn, also the squirrel bounding in his eagerness to collect the apples and plums with which the earth is covered. Here the cautious turkey calls and conducts her numerous brood to gather the grapes, and here also their mates come to fill their large and gluttonous crops. Golden pheasants, the quail, the partridge, woodcock, and numerous dove swarm in the woods and cover the country, which is dotted and broken with thickets and high forests of full-grown trees. There are 10 species of forest trees. Among them are the walnut, white oak, red oak, the ash, the pine, whitewood, and cottonwood, straight as arrows, without knots, and almost without branches, except at the very top, and of prodigious size. The fish here are nourished and bathed by living water of crystal clearness, and their great abundance renders them none the less delicious. Swans are so numerous that one would take for lilies the reeds in which they are crowded together. The gabbling goose, the duck, the widgeon, a kind of duck, and the bustard are so abundant that to give an idea of their numbers I must use the expression of a savage whom I asked before arriving if there was much game. So much, he said, that they draw up in lines to let the boats pass through. In a word, the climate is temperate, and the air purified through the day and night by a gentle breeze. The skies are always serene and spread sweet and fresh influence, which makes one enjoy a tranquil sleep. Cadillac landed at the narrowest part of the river, where the city now stands, and began to build the little village which was to survive without a break the conflicts of the coming century. In this wilderness, inhabited only by wild beasts and savages, the first thought must be for defense. Only when that was provided could the settlers turn to plan for their own shelter from wind and weather. On the first rise of ground back from the river along the line of the present Jefferson Avenue, Cadillac marked out a space for a little less than an acre, with a width of about 2 city blocks and a depth of 1, which was to be enclosed by a palisade. Small trees were hewn in the forest and fashioned into sharply pointed pickets, which were driven into the ground as close as possible, thus forming a solid fence 10 or 12 feet high. At the 4 corners were bastions of stout oak pickets from which the soldiers could shoot along the line of the palisade. Inside the stockade, Cadillac laid out a street 12 feet wide and assigned small lots to the settlers and soldiers. The settlers bought theirs outright, but Cadillac retained the ownership of the others. 50 hours after their landing, on the day sacred to St. Anne, they began the foundation of a chapel on the very spot where St. Anne's Church stands today. In a month, the chapel was completed by a rude cross placed over the door, and a bell summoned the colonists to daily prayer. When the storehouse and magazine for ammunition were also finished, the people set to work on their own log huts. Trees were cut in the forest, and the rough-hewn logs were hauled to the spot. There a framework was set up. The logs were fitted into it, and the cracks were filled with mortar and mud. Last of all, the top was covered with a roof of birch bark, or was thatched with grass. Land outside the stockade was assigned for agriculture, each soldier having a half-acre for cultivation, and the civilians larger tracts. That very year, wheat was sown for the next summer. With remarkable speed, the settlement sprang up in the wilderness, and before the end of August, took on an appearance of stability and permanence. Cadillac now summoned the Indians to council and urged them to build settlements in the vicinity. He was wise enough to see that if a sufficient number of friendly Indians located near by traders would come to buy their fur, the colony could rely on greater numbers in case of attack, and the scanty 3 months' supply of provisions brought from Montreal could be eked out by food bought from Indian hunters. 3 large villages sprang up, and within 8 months the population of the strait was some 6,000 people, whites and Indians. Hitherto, there had been on the Great Lakes nothing looking to family life or a permanent residence, but in the spring of 1702, Madame Cadillac and Madame Tonty, wife of the captain of the garrison, started in open canoes manned by Indians and Canadians on the 700-mile journey from Montreal to Detroit. At a season when storms were likely to be frequent, these 2 women braved the hardships of the trip, going up the rapids of the St. Lawrence, across Lake Ontario and around Niagara, and up Lake Erie to the Strait. With her, Madame Cadillac brought her little boy, Jacques, 6 years of age. Her oldest son was already with his father. These were the first white women to come to the Great Lakes. They were soon followed by the wives and families of other settlers. By 1708, the settlement had grown so fast that houses were built outside the stockade, as the 29 huts within the enclosure were not sufficient to accommodate the people. The little colony suffered the usual troubles of frontier life, but managed to survive them. In 1703, several of the buildings were destroyed by a fire set by the Indians. For the first few years, the colony was managed by a company, but in 1705, Cadillac succeeded in getting full control and ruled there with as absolute sway as had any feudal chief in his turreted castle. He owned the public buildings and defenses, and he alone could grant lots for settlement. From him alone could the people obtain their liquor, and to prevent excessive drinking by the Indians and traders, he restricted the amount sold to each person at one time and charged a high price for it. To him also all must come for permits to carry on their different trades and occupations. For every privilege the people must pay, and right bitterly did they complain of their commandant to his enemies, though when he walked along the narrow street, firm and erect in soldierly costume, and with clanking sword, every hat was doffed. Doubtless, some of his charges were exorbitant, but the money was turned back into the improvement of the colony, as for instance to build a public windmill where the people could pay to have their corn ground. The blacksmith complained that he had to pay 600 francs a year and 2 casks of ale for the privilege of blacksmithing, beside having to keep all Cadillac's horses shod. The latter task could not have been very arduous, for until 1706 there were no horses in the settlement, and of the 3 that Cadillac bought in that year, only one, named Colin, was alive in 1711. In 1710, Cadillac was ordered to go to Louisiana to govern the colony there, and his connection with Detroit and the Great Lakes was brought to an abrupt end. The settlement, which he handed over to his successor, was fairly prosperous. In the following winter, however, while the men of the neighboring Indian tribe were away at their hunting grounds, 1,000 or more hostile Indians of the Fox Wisconsin River tribes descended upon the region and prepared to settle there. The colonists were powerless to prevent them, but waited anxiously for the return of the hunting parties. In May they came, and under the leadership of the French, finally drove off the enemy after a hard and bloody siege in which many lives were lost. For the next 10 years the colony was so weak that its abandonment was contemplated. Successive governors mismanaged its internal affairs, demanding tolls and fees so exorbitant that traders refused to come there. Cadillac's demands had been for the advancement of the colony. These men used their power to enrich themselves. In 1720 and 1721, Financial distress in France sent many a ruined Frenchman to Detroit, so that in 1722 the population was against 200, as it had been at the time of its founder's departure. For the next 30 years, the story of Detroit was uneventful. The settlement increased gradually in numbers and strength. Of its hardship we may best judge by the large mortality of children in those years. By the middle of the century we find the authorities in Canada so eager to have the colonies on the Great Lakes strong and permanent that the following inducements are offered in a proclamation posted by order of the Governor-General in all the parishes of Canada. Every man who will go to settle in Detroit shall receive gratuitously 1 spade, 1 axe, 1 plowshare, 1 large and 1 small wagon. We will make an advance of the other 2 tools to be paid for in 2 years only. He will be given a cow, also a sow. Seed will be advanced the first year, to be returned at the 3rd harvest. The women and children will be supported for 1 year. Those will be deprived of the liberty of the king who shall give themselves up to trade in place of agriculture. In this way, men with families were encouraged to make France strong in her western outposts. Within a year, 100 persons responded, and an official census shows a population at Detroit of nearly 500 persons, of whom 33 were women over 15 and 95 girls under that age. This represents no more floating population of traders and adventurers. The property returns of the inhabitants show them to have been an agricultural people who made the most of the rich land on which they lived. In the census they reported 160 horses in place of the one of 40 years before, and 682 cattle. The fertility of the Strait of Detroit seemed to inspire even the roving Canadian, usually so restless and adventurous, with a desire to plant and develop a home. Chapter 9. Niagara in the Loss of Canada. The importance of Niagara in trade and warfare was early recognized by both the French and the English, as well as by the Iroquois. La Salle and Denonville, in their desire to monopolize the Indian trade, had built fortified storehouses on the shore of the river, but both had been destroyed by the Iroquois. By the beginning of the 18th century, the English began to make serious inroads on the fur trade of the interior, and the French became more anxious than ever to secure a permanent foothold at Niagara. For 25 years, French and English orators harangued at Indian councils, begging for permission to build forts or trading houses at that point. Governors wrote home for the necessary funds to purchase the Indians' consent, and rival traders watched every camp on the river with suspicion. At length, French diplomacy won the day. In 1720, Joncaire, with the help of Charles de Moyne, Chevalier de Longueuil, gained from the Indians a reluctant consent to the building of a barkhouse at Niagara. He made the most of this permission, and on the site of Lewiston built a large house, 40 feet wide and 30 long, which could accommodate 50 traders. This he surrounded with a high fence or palisade and named the Magazin Royal. In their turn, the English built a similar, though smaller, house at Oswego in 1722, from which the Indians could go by portage the Oswego River to Lake Oneida, and gaining the Mohawk could paddle their fur-laden canoes to Albany. In their first permission to the French, the Iroquois had carefully stipulated that the house to be built at Niagara should be of bark, for they had learned the danger of stone forts. Now, Le Moyne told them that he could not keep his skins dry in a bark house, and wrung from them an unwilling consent to the erection of a stone house, provided it be no stone fort. The authorities at once wrote the king asking for money to defray the expense of building a house of solid masonry. De la Rey, the king's chief engineer, who had come out to fortify Quebec and Montreal, was directed to proceed to Niagara and to build this trading house. He decided not to put it near Joncaire's station, which was 7 miles up the river, where the rapids made further navigation impossible, but to place it at the outlet of the river into Lake Ontario. On the eastern bank of the Niagara, near its mouth, he began the erection of the stone structure which stands today as the oldest part of the government buildings at Fort Niagara. It took 2 summers in time and 30,000 livres in money to spend. When completed, the House of Stone possessed 4 bastions erected with a massiveness of construction that made it strong after nearly 200 years have passed away. Charles Le Moyne, who had gained the Indians' consent to the building of the stone house, was put in command and held it for many years. The first Charles Le Moyne came to Canada in 1654, and for a century his sons and grandsons played most important parts in the building of the French power in the New World. 2 of his sons led the attack on Schenectady and later founded Louisiana. A 3rd son fell in the defense of Quebec against Sir William Phipps in 1690, and another in the struggle with the English for Hudson's Bay. The 2nd Charles Le Moyne accompanied Le Barre and Denonville on their expeditions against the Iroquois, and the 3rd established this fortified post at Niagara. In 140 years, more or less, the French had made wonderful progress in opening up the interior of North America to exploration and trade. They had founded settlements at the extremities of their domain on the St. Lawrence and the lower Mississippi, and had connected these by a chain of forts on the Great Lakes and the northern tributaries of the Mississippi, but they had established only one strong colony in the interior, the settlement at Detroit. As the middle of the 18th century approached, they awoke to the need of making good their calm in the Ohio Valley, building a line of forts at Presque Isle on Lake Erie, Le Boeuf-du-Chêne on the route from that lake to the Ohio River. They also strengthened themselves by erecting a fort on the southern shore of Lake Erie at Sandusky, about halfway between Cleveland and Detroit. The energy of the French was in part due to the exhibition of an intention of the English to enter the great interior basin, but the French activity aroused the English, and in 1754 the final contest for the control of the continent began in the western wilderness of Virginia and Pennsylvania. With the war elsewhere, this book has nothing to do. The campaigns for the capture of Duquesne, Louisbourg, Ticonderoga, Quebec, and Montreal all took place far away from the shores of the Great Lakes. But it was the success of the English in these other fields that determined the fate of the interior. From the beginning, the importance of Niagara had been recognized by both combatants, but the strength of its position deferred an attack upon it for several years. In 1758, the English captured Fort Frontenac, and the next summer made a determined attack on Niagara. The fort at Niagara was now commanded by a French officer and engineer, Captain Pouchot. He had strengthened and enlarged the fortifications and had a garrison of 600 men, well supplied with food and ammunition. The English general, Prideaux, marched with a force of 2,300 men from Oswego and laid siege to the fort. The English engineers opened the trenches so near the fort that they were obliged to withdraw and build a second series. When the artillery was placed in position and opened fire, one of the first shells to be discharged burst prematurely, and a fragment, striking General Prideaux on the head, killed him instantly. Sir William Johnson took command in his place and carried on the siege effectively. In 2 or 3 weeks, the French garrison was reduced of the last extremity. The walls and defenses were riddled with shot and broken through. More than 100 of the defenders were killed or seriously wounded, and all were worn out with the strain of the constant defense day and night. Captain Pouchot still held out, for ever since the siege began he had been watching for expected assistance from the western posts. An army of 1,300 French and Indians had been gathered from the stations of the Illinois River and from Detroit, Michilimackinac, Le Boeuf, and Venango to defend the Ohio Valley. As soon as Pouchot heard that the English were coming to attack Niagara, he had sent a summons to the leaders of this force to come to his aid, and now he was daily and hourly expecting their arrival, together with the garrison of Fort Duquesne, which had abandoned that place on the approach of an English army under General Forbes. The western reinforcement was even now coming up Lake Erie under the leadership of 2 French generals. It was an oddly assorted force, such as no other time or place could have produced. A company of well-drilled colonial Militia paddled their boats beside the canoes of a war party of Indians who had been induced by traders to come from their distant homes to take part in the white men's strife. Hardly less savage than the Indian warriors were the western traders and coureurs de bois who had lived so long in Indian wigwams that they had adopted the dress, the war paint, and the customs of their neighbors. All the members of this mixed company were alike. However, in one thing they were skilled in the warfare of the woods. From Lake Erie, the fleet paddled past the site of Buffalo and down the swift-moving Niagara River, around Grand Island, and on the morning of July 24th, 1759, the soldiers and Indians landed at the head of the portage path a mile and a half above the falls. Here the French found the ruins of their fort of the portage of Fort Little Niagara, a trading station which had been fortified in 1750. Joncaire, a son of the Joncaire who built the first trading house on the river, had occupied this post till recently, but had burned it at the approach of the British. The army made its way over the rough 7-mile portage path and down over the rocks to the old French trading house. From here they proceeded cautiously along the bank of the river. Sir William Johnson had meanwhile been informed by scouts of the approach of the expected French reinforcement. He divided his 2,300 men into 3 bodies, one to guard the boats on Lake Ontario, one to hold the trenches, and the third to cut off the advance of the Southern Army. For this last company he picked the Provincial Light Infantry, 2 companies of grenadiers, and 150 men of the 46th Regiment. They were commanded by Colonel Massey, under whose orders they threw up, about 1.5 miles up the river from the fort, a rough breastwork of felled trees behind which they could stand and pour shot into the ranks of the advancing enemy. The Iroquois warrior who had come with Johnson were placed along the flanks of the English. They had recently shown signs of disaffection, and when the French army came in sight they opened a parley with the Indian allies of the French. They did not last long, for they could come to no agreement, and without further delay the savages threw themselves into the fight with wild war whoops. The French made a gallant fight, but were fatally hampered by their unprotected position. For half an hour they made sallies, retreating each time after heavy losses, but led back for another assault by those who survived of their heroic officers. At last their ranks were completely broken, and they fled along the shore to regain the portage road around the falls and escape their boats. For 5 miles the English pursued them through the woods, capturing and bringing back as many as they could overtake. The bravery of the French officers and the desperate efforts that they made to check the retreat are shown by the fact that nearly all of them were either killed or captured. Their followers hastened back to their boats and retreated across Lake Erie, burning on their way Presque Island, Le Boeuf, and Venago, and journeying to the safe and distant fort of Detroit. On the morning of July 24th, Captain Pouchot, shut up in the fort at Niagara, heard the sound of distant firing and began to watch for his allies. Through the open space of the forest he could see in the far distance moving forms and groups of men meeting and parting. The English had evidently gone out to attack the advancing army. The cannonading from the trenches, which had sounded for so long in the ears of the garrison, had ceased, and the trenches seemed deserted. Captain Pouchot called for volunteers to sally forth from the fort and destroy the English works, but as soon as they appeared, the English soldiers stationed there by Johnson sprang up from their hiding places behind the works and forced the French to retreat into their fortification. At last the sound of distant firing stopped, and the smoke of guns ceased to rise from the scene of the conflict. The garrison waited hour after hour in anxious suspense. After 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a friendly Indian slipped through the lines and told of the utter rout of the relieving force. Captain Pouchot refused to believe him, but at 4 o'clock, after a sharp cannonade from the English had been answered by a similar discharge from the besieged garrison, a trumpet was sounded in the English trenches, and an officer approached the fort with a demand for its surrender. He presented also a paper with the names of the captive French officers. Captain Pouchot still refused to admit the enemy his belief in the disaster, and sent an officer of his own to see the prisoners. His worst fears were confirmed when the officer returned with the report that under a shelter of boughs near Johnson's tent were 16 officers, some of them severely wounded. All hope for the French was gone, and Captain Pouchot could only endeavour to arrange for his garrison honourable team of surrender. Such terms the English, recognizing the gallant conduct of their enemies, were glad to grant. The French were accorded all the honours of prisoners of war, although they must be sent under guard to New York. Pouchot asked, and was granted a special stipulation, that they should be protected from their Indian enemies, who might take this occasion to revenge themselves for the massacre at Fort William Henry 3 years before. He signed the Articles of Surrender and delivered over to the English the fort with 10 officers and 486 men, besides women and children. The surrender of Niagara broke the line of communication between Montreal and the interior. In the next year, 1760, the Marquis de Vaudreuil signed articles of capitulation, by which Canada and all its dependencies passed into the hands of the English, and French supremacy on the Great Lakes was ended. It remained only for the conquerors to take possession of the French posts on the Great Lakes. Chapter 10. The Conspiracy of Pontiac. On the 13th day of September, 1760, 5 days after the surrender of Montreal, Major Robert Rogers, the most energetic Indian fighter of the time, set out from Montreal with 200 of his rangers, whose exploits in war had made his name famous, for the lakes. He was to take possession of Detroit and the other lake forts for England. Reaching Niagara on the 1st day of October, they crossed by portage to the site of the modern Buffalo and skirted the southern shore of Lake Erie, encamping nightly on its margin and taking every precaution by day to keep the boats from losing sight of one another on the rough, stormy waters. One night, on the Cuyahoga River, near where the present city of Cleveland now stands, a party of Indians entered the camp and announced themselves to be ambassadors from Pontiac, the king and lord of that country, who requested them to halt until he himself should arrive in a few hours. The great sachem stalked into camp. He was of medium height, with an active, muscular figure and a stern face. His first words were an imperious demand as to Major Rogers' business. "How dare you," he said, "enter my country without my leave?" "I do not come with any design against you or your people," replied Rogers, "but to remove out of your country the French who have been an obstacle in our way to mutual peace and commerce." The Indian who greeted Rogers so haughtily was the principal chief of the Ottawa and Ojibwe tribes, a man to whom all the nations of the Illinois country deferred, and whose name was held in respect even by the distant Algonquins of the St. Lawrence. Rogers told him of his present mission, taking occasion to dwell on the total defeat of the French in Canada, and gave him several belts of wampum in token for his friendly intent. These Pontiac accepted with dignity, but without any sign of unbending. He announced that he stood in the path of the English, travelled in until the next morning, and preferred a string of wampum to intimidate that they must not march farther without his leave. He inquired whether the party was in need of anything he or his warriors could supply, and then withdrew. The English kept a double force on guard all night, but in the morning Pontiac came with his attendant chiefs and declared that he had made peace with Rogers and his detachment, and that they might therefore pass through his country unmolested and expel the French garrison from Detroit. He was inclined, he said, to live peaceably with the English, while they used him as he deserved, but if they treated him with neglect, he should shut up the way and exclude them from his domains. The pipe of peace was passed around, and the council fired and smoked by officers and chiefs alike. As Rogers and his men proceeded on their way, they found the march made easy by the powerful influence of Pontiac, who dissuaded a war party of Detroit Indians from attacking them, furnished guides, and welcomed supplies of venison, turkeys, and parched corn. He even sent word ahead to the Indians within the limits of the fort that he was a friend of the English, making it impossible for the French commander to get any help from them. In the role of guide, counselor, and patronizing friend of the newly arrived strangers, this remarkable savage comes for the first time into prominence in history. 3 years later, he was to make of what would have been without his leadership a series of spasmodic and scattering raids, a formidable and sustained Indian uprising of the most serious kind. Rogers took Detroit, sent the French commander and his garrison down to Niagara, disarmed the Canadian militia, and received the oath of allegiance from all the inhabitants, and in a few hours Detroit was in name at least an English town. Within a year, all the posts on the lakes came into English possession, but the English were far from gaining the hearty support of either the French-Canadian inhabitants, who were naturally not pleased at this change of hands, or even of the Indian tribes, who liked the French. The French had always had unusual success in dealing with the Indians. They were friendly with them, tolerant of their presence, and generous with their gifts. Without any insulting show of patronage, the previous reputation of the English was bad amongst the Indians. They resented their austere manners, their steady seizure of forest lands for agriculture, and their ill-concealed contempt for the red man. This bad name had been somewhat obscured in these recent years by the excellent prices paid by the English for furs and their lavish gifts to gain Indian support, but it was now confirmed at every post along the whole frontier. When the two rival nations were using the Indians as allies, both had treated them with respect and endeavored to gain their friendship. Now the Indians began to realize that this friendship was no longer considered valuable, but that the English were insolently seizing more and more of their domain, with the apparent intention of driving them out. Their chiefs were no longer treated with respect as they hung about the white men's forts. Owing to a sudden policy of retrenchment, the gifts, too, were cut down or withheld altogether until the savages really suffered from want of supplies, which the wise Frenchmen had seen the necessity of providing for them. The customary amount of powder was denied them, and the Indians feared lest their independence was threatened. The English fur trade was in lawless hands, and the traders abused and outraged the Indians, while they cheated them out of their lawful duties. The discontent of the natives was encouraged and fostered by the French traders and settlers, who told their sullen audiences incredible tales of the further evil purposes of the English, and spread far and wide a rumor that the armies of the French were even now advancing up the St. Lawrence and Mississippi rivers to drive out these pretenders. Suddenly, in May 1763, the Indians uprose with characteristic secrecy, and stealth the tribes exchanged wampum belts, spreading the summons to war and signifying return acquiescence in the plan. With hardly a suspicion on the part of their indifferent English neighbors, occasionally in the last month a story was brought in that roused the anxiety of those who were wise in the ways of the Indians, but these were laughed to scorn. Looking back, one marvels both at the secrecy with which the uprising was planned, and at the serene confidence of the scanty garrisons stationed at these isolated and dangerous outposts. From contemporary accounts it appears that at Presque Isle there were 27 men, at Michilimackinac 35 men with their officers, at the foot of Lake Michigan on the St. Joseph's River 15, and at Fort Miami 10, while the other posts were held by mere handfuls of soldiers. Detroit was the only station that was sustainably manned. In their dealings with white men, the Indians had never before been banded together under a single leader. The tribes were restless and jealous of one another, but Pontiac restrained and humored them. He made his plans so well, and they were carried out so secretly and energetically, that within 10 weeks of the time when the first blow was struck, not a single post remained in British hands west of Niagara, save only the fort of Detroit, where he himself conducted the siege in person. The garrison at Detroit was commanded by Major Gladwin, a young British officer who had taken an active part in the war with the French and had been at Detroit for nearly a year. He had 8 officers and 120 men in his command, and besides the Canadian residents, whose white cottages lined either bank of the river, there were about 40 fur traders at the settlement. The original stockade had been several times enlarged since Cadillac's day, once recently during the 3 years of English occupation. It contained about 100 small houses, a well-built group of barracks, a council home, and a church. 3 rows of pickets, 25 feet high, with large gateways surmounted by block houses for observation and defense, had taken the place of the original 12-foot fence. Within each gateway, which was closed at sunset, was a small wicket, through which one person could enter at a time. This was kept open until 9 o'clock. The fort was protected by 3 small cannon, one carrying 3-pound balls, the other 2 6-pounders, but these guns were badly mounted and better calculated to terrify the Indians than to render much actual assistance. Far more effective were the two small vessels, the Beaver and the Gladwin, which lay anchored in the stream. At a council on the 27th of April, 1763, Pontiac inflamed the minds of his hearers by reporting a vision vouchsafed to him by the Great Spirit, who asked him why the Indians suffered these English, these dogs dressed in red, to dwell among them. The first step of his plan, as he unfolded it to his warriors, was to spy out the land. On May Day 1760, 40 men of the Ottawa tribe, purporting to have returned from their winter hunting grounds, went to the fort and asked permission to dance the calumet dance before the English officers. They were admitted, and while 30 of them danced, the remaining 10 strolled about and noted every detail of the defense, all retiring at the close without rousing any suspicion in the minds of their hosts. 4 days later, one of the leading French settlers brought in word that his wife, while purchasing supplies in the Ottawa village, had found the warriors filing off the ends of their gun barrels so as to make them only about a yard long, probably with some treacherous intent of concealing them more easily. The next day, Major Gladwin was informed of the plot for the destruction of his garrison on the morrow. 2 stories are told of the source of this information. One, that an Indian girl to whom he had been kind made it known to him, and another that a friendly young warrior told him. We would like to believe the former, which tells of the reluctance of the beautiful girl to depart after she had done her errand of delivering a pair of embroidered moccasins ordered by Major Gladwin, and of her confession to him, when he pressed her for the reason of her sad manner, that danger threatened him and his men. Gladwin hardly believed the story, but made all preparations to thwart the plans of Pontiac if occasion offered. The next morning, the guards in the blockhouse saw Pontiac and 60 men land from their canoes and walk in Indian file up the river road towards the gateway of the stockade. They were admitted and escorted to the council chamber, where Major Gladwin and his principal officers were awaiting them. It is said that even the iron composure of Pontiac was shaken, and that he gave a momentary start when he saw drawn up on either side of the gateway and standing about in watchful groups in the streets the armed soldiers of the garrison. The officers, too, were in full uniform, with their swords at their sides and a brace of pistols in their belts. Before he was seated, Pontiac asked, "Why do I see so many of my father's young men standing in the street with their guns?" "To keep them in good discipline and exercise them," replied Major Gladwin through his interpreter. When the Indians were seated on the skins prepared for them, Pontiac began his address. Holding in his hand the wampum belt, which had been agreed upon as the signal for attack, he spoke of the friendship of the Indians for the English. Once, it is said, he raised it as if to give the signal, but Gladwin signed with his hand, and the soldiers, without the open door, made a clattering with their arms. Pontiac trembled and gave the belt in his usual way instead of in the manner agreed upon in the council. Gladwin replied that the Indians should have the friendship of the English just so long as they keep the peace, but not 1 moment longer. Some writers say that he drew aside the blanket of the chief nearest of him, and showed hidden in its folds a shortened gun. At any rate, the English found out that every chief was armed, and knew that they had narrowly escaped a frightful massacre. The Indians were awed by the sharp rebuke of Gladwin into departing quietly. For 2 days they attempted to parley with the English and gain admittance by deceit, but Gladwin was firm that not more than 60 might enter the fort at one time, and on the 9th of May, Pontiac threw aside his mask of pretended friendship. Hostilities were begun by the Indians, murdering an old English sergeant who lived on a neighboring island. The Indians moved their camp to the same side of the river as the fort, establishing themselves just above the line of the French houses. One more attempt was made for peace when 2 brave English officers, Captain Campbell and Lieutenant McDougall, insisted upon risking their lives in the Indian camp to see if they could persuade the savages to desist from war. Both were detained by the Indians, despite the previous promises of Pontiac. Lieutenant McDougall later made his escape, but Captain Campbell was murdered by the natives in an outburst of anger. The blockade of Detroit was begun, and many months were to pass before a white man could venture in daylight to step outside the little wicket or to show his head at a porthole or window without fear of Indian bullets. For weeks, everyone from Major Gladwin down to the lowest soldier was on the watch night and day, no man lying down to sleep except in his clothes and with his gun beside him. The garrison began to suffer for food and would have been forced to withdraw from the fort and escape down the lake had not a few friendly Canadians smuggled in supplies. The Indians, too, whose method of warfare is that of sudden attack rather than of protracted siege, had not sufficient food, but began to make raids on the Canadian families who thought taking no part in the struggle were in general indifferent to the English. At a time like this, the remarkable gifts of Pontiac came out. With a foresight and method most unusual in a savage, he established a base of supplies, undertook a systematic levy on those who had provisions, and gave out a regular amount each day to every Indian. On the 29th of May, after the blockade had been going on for 3 weeks, the long-expected boats from Niagara, which had been summoned by Major Gladwin in the first days of the siege, were seen rounding the wooded point below the fort. The red flag of England flying at their stern, all was rejoicing within the fort until, as the boats came nearer, the English saw that they were occupied and guided by Indians. 3 Englishmen who escaped to the fort brought a mournful tale of a night attack and seizure of the boats at the mouth of the Detroit River, and also of the destruction of Sandusky and Presque Isle. This was the first of many reports that were to come during that month of similar successful attacks, until the little garrison at Detroit was the only one left on the upper lakes. The remaining Englishmen of the rescuing party were massacred that night in the Indian camp. Toward the end of June, Pontiac sent another summons to surrender, saying that 900 Indians from the north were on their way to join him. Major Gladwin refused to consider terms till Captain Campbell and Lieutenant McDougall were returned to him, and once more hostilities were resumed. On the 30th of June, the Gladwin, which was about the middle of May, had eluded the Indians and slipped down the river to Niagara, succeeded in making her way up the river and landing at the fort a force of 50 men, together with much-needed provisions and ammunition. She brought the news that peace had been formally concluded between England and France. While many of the French Canadians refused to admit the truth of this report and continued to romance to the Indians about large French armies that were approaching, Fordley setters accepted their new position as English subjects and took service under Gladwin. Through them, the English officers were kept even better informed of what went on without the fort than before, but always throughout the blockade there seem to have been daily reports from some source of what happened in the Indian camp, as well as frequent sorties from the fort. During the month of July, the efforts of the Indians were directed particularly against the 2 armed vessels, which had not only afforded defense to the fort and brought men and supplies, but had begun to make trips up the river to a point opposite the Indian camp from which they could pour shot into the wigwams. One night, the attention of the watchful sentries was attracted by a mass of flames shooting up into the sky in the general direction of the Indian camp. Their first thought was that the village was on fire, but the mass of flames seemed to be moving and to come nearer. A huge fire float made of 4 bateaux filled with faggots, birch bark, and tar appeared on the water, drifting down to set fire to the schooners anchored opposite the fort. The vessels were anchored by 2 cables, and as the blazing raft approached, they slipped one cable and swung to the other side of the river, while the raft floated harmlessly by, lighting up the fort and the dark shores till it burned itself down to the water's edge. The next event of the blockade came at the end of that month. On the 29th of July, the garrison heard firing down the river. They waited anxiously, wondering what new disaster was to fall upon them, for similar sounds had often been followed by the arrival of a single survivor from some abandoned fort with a tale of Indian butchery. Half an hour later, the sentries called to their officers to come quickly, for the whole surface of the water was covered with boats. In breathless suspense, the weary garrison waited to see if the story of the 2 months before was to be repeated, and dusky forms were to appear crouching in captured English vessels, but they were reassured by the salute of an English gun. In an hour, 260 men had landed at the little wharf and been welcomed with cheers and shouts. Captain Dalyell had been sent from Niagara with companies from 2 regiments and with 20 of Rogers' Rangers, commanded by Major Rogers himself, to put an end to the siege. The newcomers were eager to sally forth and meet the Indians. Gladwin, who had been made wary by long months of experience with Pontiac, strenuously opposed Dalyell's plan of a night attack and only gave his consent when the latter threatened to leave Detroit unless some such bold stroke was permitted. About 2 o'clock in the morning, on the 31st day of July, 250 men marched in 3 detachments up the bank of the river, past the French cottages, to a little stream 1.5 miles above the fort. Treacherous Canadians who had in some way learned of the plan had warned the Indians, and as the advance guard passed across the bridge which spanned the stream, the Indians dashed down from the heights above and poured volleys of musketry into the English ranks. The soldiers recoiled for a moment, then they pushed on over the bridge, but the savages vanished, yelling into the darkness beyond. For a time the English pressed on, shot at from every side, but flesh and blood could not stand against the invisible enemy. The remaining troops endeavored to retreat in orderly fashion, but were soon under heavy fire again from a rear ambuscade of Indians. Major Rogers gained entrance to a house on the road, and from its windows commanded the road with his guns and covered the retreat. The 2 bateaux which had followed the party up the river were loaded with the dead and wounded. Slowly the English made their way back under constant fire, and by 8 o'clock the survivors gained the shelter of the fort. Of the 250 who had gone out 6 hours before, 159 had been killed or wounded, and Captain Dalyell himself had lost his life. The victory of Bloody Run, as the stream was ever afterwards called, restored the confidence of Pontiac and brought many accessories to his side, but in spite of this disaster Major Gladwin, who his reinforced garrison of over 200 able-bodied men, was confident of ultimate success. The schooner Gladwin made her way again to Niagara and returned early in September with a welcome load of 47 barrels of flour and 100 barrels of pork, but with a tale of Indian attack and the loss of 6 of her crew of 12. Other attempts from Niagara to relieve the garrison were unsuccessful, but Pontiac received in October a heavy blow in a letter from the French commander at Fort Chartres in the Illinois country, saying that not only could he offer Pontiac no help, but he was now at peace with the English and wished the Indians to follow his example. This message had its effect. Pontiac had had great hopes of French assistance. With these hopes dashed, he knew he could not hold out much longer. Already his warriors were weary of the attack and deserting him. He sent a letter to Gladwin, asking for peace and agreeing to forget the bad things that had happened if the Englishmen would do the same. Gladwin replied that he would grant a truce, while he sent Pontiac's message to his general, who alone had power to grant pardon. As it was then late in the season, it was deemed best to leave the matter in this condition until spring, as it held the Indians in a wholesome state of uncertainty. Within a few days, the encampment in the vicinity of Detroit was abandoned. After a confinement of 5 long months, the inhabitants of the town could venture outside the stockade without dread of Indian bullets. A report was sent to General Amherst, the commander of the British Army, and during the winter plans were made to relieve Detroit and bring peace to the lake region. A military expedition was to be sent in the spring to force the tribes into submission, and in the meantime Sir William Johnson, the superintendent of Indian affairs, dispatched messages to all the tribes, warning them of the coming expedition and urging those who were ready to make peace to come while there was yet time to a grand council fire at Niagara. From the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi, from Lake Superior and eastern New York, the friendly tribes came up in July to Niagara. When Johnson stepped ashore from the boat which brought him from Oswego, he saw, dotting the fields, the wigwams of more than 1,000 Indians, and in a few days the number was doubled. Councils were held at which the representatives of the tribes promised their friendship to the English, agreed to restore the forts to cede lands, and in so far as their own nations were concerned, to guarantee safe navigation on the lakes. This convention was the most remarkable assemblage of Indians that had ever gathered on the shores of the Great Lakes. While the council was in progress, Colonel Bradstreet arrived at Niagara with his troops, and when it was over, he proceeded up Lake Erie to Detroit, for Pontiac and his tribes had not come to the conference, and Detroit was still in danger. During the winter, the Indians had left the town in peace, but in the spring, warriors had returned to encamp on the strait and had made occasional attacks. In August 1769, 15 months from the time when Pontiac and his 6 chiefs sat in Gladwin's council chamber, the English army under General Bradstreet came to relieve the weary garrison. Pontiac sent a message of defiance to the English chief, but he sent it from the safe distance of a village on the Maumee River, 40 or 50 miles away, in what is now the state of Ohio. Fresh troops were put in place of the worn-out veterans of the siege. Such Indians as remained in the vicinity came in and offered their allegiance to the English, and Gladwin, weary of fighting the Indians, started down Lake Erie on his way to England. Now that his defense of Detroit was honorably ended, he was glad to resign his commission. Lesser posts had fallen, but Detroit had been saved, and with it the Upper Lakes. Pontiac spent the next 2 years among the western tribes of the Illinois region. In the summer of 1766, he went to Oswego, and as official representative of the tribe of the West offered to Sir William Johnson his friendship and theirs. His conspiracy had failed, and he returned sadly to his home in the Illinois village. For 2 years little is known of him, but in April 1769 his name became once more the watchword of bloodshed and slaughter. From tribe to tribe, runners carried the news that he had been murdered in an Indian village, and the nations rose in their wrath to avenge the death of their great chief. The Illinois nation, to which the assassin belonged, was almost wiped out, and internal feuds sprang up between the tribes till the Indians of the southern lake region were involved, and the death of Pontiac was avenged among his people by the period of universal tribal war. Chronology of the ending of French rule. 1759, capture of Quebec and Niagara. 1760, capture of Montreal and surrender of Canada, taking possession of Detroit. 1763, Pontiac's attack and the fall of the other posts of the Western Lakes, Treaty of Peace. 1764, Sir William Johnson's conference at Niagara, Bradstreet's expedition up Lake Erie, and the close of the blockade of Detroit. Chapter 11. The Adventures of a Trader. A fur trader by the name of Alex Henry was the first Englishman to reach Mackinac after the fall of New France. His story of his adventures gives a graphic picture of the course of events on the Upper Lakes during the years when the siege of Detroit and the Indian uprising under Pontiac left the northern forts isolated and unprotected. Henry reached Fort Mackinac in September 1761. For the latter part of his journey from Montreal, he had adopted the guise of a French trader, for the Indians stopped every party to inquire whether any Englishman was coming to the lakes. As soon as his nationality became known at Mackinac, he was warned by the Canadians that he should lose no time in making his escape to Detroit, as the Indians would not tolerate the presence of an Englishman. Henry suspected that the Canadians had fostered this spirit to retain control of the fur trade, and were exaggerating the dangers of his position in the hope of frightening him away. Still, it did not add to his comfort to hear that a party of Indians was coming to pay him a visit. As he sat in his house one afternoon, the door opened, and an Indian chief, 6 feet tall, walked quietly in. Behind him were 60 more, each with a tomahawk in one hand and a scalping knife in the other. In absolute silence, they stalked into the room in single file, seated themselves at a sign from their leader on the floor, and began to smoke their pipes. In the long pause that followed, Henry had time to study his formidable visitors. Their faces were painted with charcoal, mixed with grease, and their bodies, bare to the waist, were decorated with white clay plastered on in various patterns. Some had feathers thrust through their noses, others had them stuck into their hair. Unless their purpose was friendly, these warriors would not be safe guests for a single trader to entertain. After a long time, the chief began to address him. He told him that because of his bravery in venturing into this country alone, he might stay among them in spite of his being an Englishman. The hated enemy of their father, the King of France, the august assembly ended with a request that the young men be allowed to taste his English milk, meaning rum, and the trader was assured of his safety at Mackinac. That week, a detachment of English troops arrived from the lower lakes, and the trader's protection was ensured. Henry fitted out expeditions to go into the interior to buy furs of the more remote Indian tribes, and prepared to spend the winter at the fort. During these months at Mackinac, and the succeeding winter which he spent at Sault Ste. Marie, he was much interested in the fisheries. In both these straits, the whitefish were very abundant. At Sault Ste. Marie, in the late autumn, there was such a run of fish that 2 men would go out in a canoe, one paddling and the other handling a scoop net on the end of a 10-foot pole, and would return in 2 hours with a catch of 500 whitefish, each weighing from 6 to 15 pounds. The steersman would guide the canoe in and out between the sharp rocks and rushing rapids. The fisherman would dip his net and throw in a pile of fish, and before long the canoe would be loaded down to the water's edge. During the winter, the fish were cured by drying them in smoke and packed for transportation to the nearest frontier ports, and even for the markets of the St. Lawrence. In May 1763, when Henry returned to Mackinac, he found that the traders who were gathered there brought rumors of Indian hostility. These reports were disregarded by the officers of the garrison, who with their force of soldiers and their fort could not believe there was any cause for alarm. Henry himself received a warning. The year before, he had won the friendship of one of the Chippewa Indians, named Wawatam, who had surprised him one day by bringing his whole family to the trader's house, offering a present of skins, sugar, and dried meat, and declaring his wish of adopting him into his family as a brother. Henry had accepted the honor, and thought no more of the incident until now, in the spring of 1763, his Indian brother came to his house in a very sober mood, and begged him to go back to the Sioux the next morning with himself and his family. He further inquired whether the commandant of the fort had not heard bad news, saying that he himself had been frequently disturbed by the noise of evil birds. He hinted that there were many more Indians about the fort than the English had seen. Henry paid little attention to the Indian's words, but the next morning he returned with his wife, and once more entreated the traders to go with him. Henry was not sufficiently familiar with the Chippewa language to follow all his figurative and elaborate speech, and unfortunately turned a deaf ear to his plea. After long effort, the chief went sadly away. He had warned Henry that all the Indians were coming in a body one day soon to demand liquor of the commandant, and that before they became intoxicated he had better be gone. Henry kept careful watch, but except that a great many Indians came in the next day to purchase tomahawks, he saw nothing unusual. The next day, the 4th of June, was the king's birthday, and from this time on, we will let Henry tell his own story. The morning was sultry. A Chippewa came to tell me that his nation was going to play a bagataway, called by the Canadians La Crosse, with the Sacs, another Indian nation. He invited me to witness the sport, adding that the commandant was to be there and would bet on the side of the Chippewas. In consequence of this information, I went to the commandant and expostulated with him a little, representing that the Indians might possibly have some sinister end in view, but he only smiled at my suspicions. I did not go myself to see the match, which was now to be played without the fort, because, there being a canoe prepared to depart on the following day for Montreal, I employed myself in writing letters to my friends, and even when a fellow trader, Mr. Tracy, happened to call upon me, saying that another canoe had just arrived from Detroit, and proposing that I should go with him to the beach to inquire the news. It so happened that I still remained to finish my letters, promising to follow Mr. Tracy in the course of a few minutes. Mr. Tracy had not gone more than 20 paces from my door, when I heard an Indian war cry and a noise of general confusion. Going instantly to my window, I saw a crowd of Indians within the fort, furiously cutting down and scalping every Englishman they found. I had, in the room in which I was, a fowling piece loaded with shot. This I immediately seized and held it for a few minutes, waiting to hear the drum beat to arms. In this dreadful interval, I saw several of my countrymen fall. At length, realizing that there was no hope of a call to arms, and that one person could do nothing against 400 Indians, Henry decided to seek shelter for himself. He saw that many of the Canadian inhabitants of the fort were calmly looking on, neither helping nor hindering the Indians, and conceived the hope that he might be safe in one of their houses. He climbed the low fence that separated his house from that of Mr. Langlade, his next neighbor, and found the whole family at the window gazing at the scene of blood before them. Henry begged Mr. Langlade to put him in some place of safety, but he paid no attention. This, says Henry, was a moment for despair, but the next an Indian woman, a slave of Mr. Langlade, beckoned to me to follow her. She brought me to a door which she opened, desiring me to enter, and telling me that it led to the garret, where I must go and conceal myself. The woman locked the door after him, and from his hiding place he looked out on the horrible scenes that were passing without. Soon everyone who could be found had been massacred, and there was a general cry, "All is finished." At the same instant, Indians entered the house and asked Mr. Langlade whether there were any Englishmen in the house. The Canadian replied that he did not know of any, for the Indian woman had kept her secret, but that they might hunt for themselves. They were delayed in their search by a hunt for the key of the garret door, and in those few moments Henry hid himself under a pile of birch-bark vessels. 4 Indians came up with Mr. Langlade, walked around the dark garret so near to the fugitive that they might have touched him, told how many they had killed and how many scalps they had taken, and went off again, locking the door after them. Exhausted by suspense, Henry fell asleep, and was awakened in the evening by Mrs. Langlade, who came up to the garret and was much surprised to find him there. She gave him a little water to drink and told him she hoped he would escape. The next morning the Indians returned and discovered the traitor's hiding place. As Indians walked into the garret and seized him with one hand by the collar of his coat, while in the other he brandished a large carving knife as if he meant to plunge it into him. For some seconds, the Indians looked into Henry's eyes and then dropped his arm, saying, "I won't kill you." He added that he had once lost a brother, and that he would call his prisoner after him. He was going to take him to his cabin, but Henry begged Mr. Langlade to request that he be allowed to stay in the garret, as the Indians were so intoxicated that no Englishman would be safe amongst them. Once more the traitor settled himself in the garret to await his fate, but in an hour an Indian came, purporting to be from his new master, and led him outside the fort among the bushes, where he tried to murder him. Henry managed to escape and ran with all speed to the fort, where he found his master, who gave him protection. The next morning 3 other Englishmen who had escaped massacre were brought to Mr. Langlade's house. From them Henry learned the game of lacrosse had been a device to get as many Englishmen as possible outside the walls. It had been agreed that a ball should be tossed, as if by accident, over the pickets of the fort, and that it should be instantly followed by all engaged in the game. When a sufficient number were inside, they could seize the fort. 20 Englishmen had survived the massacre. They consulted together to see whether there was any hope of their regaining possession of the station, but were forced to decide that without the help of the Canadian inhabitants, who could not be counted upon, it was impossible. The next day, the prisoners went through a strange experience. They were put into canoes and told that they were to be taken to the Castor Island in Lake Michigan, but a thick fog came up, and their guards thought it safer to keep near shore and paddled towards an Ottawa village. Every half-hour the Indians gave their war whoops, one for every prisoner in the canoe, in order to notify all other Indians of the number of prisoners they were taking. At the Ottawa village they were greeted by an Ottawa chief, who made signs to them to land. When they came within a few hundred yards of the shore, warriors rushed into the water, dragged the prisoners from the canoes, and carried them ashore. The English thought that their last moments had come, but the Ottawas hastened to assure that they were their friends. The Ottawas were indignant because they had not been consulted by the Chippewas about destroying the English. Therefore they had rescued the prisoners from the Chippewas, who were taking them to the Castor Islands to kill them. Before long, the bewildered prisoners were returning to Mackinac in the canoes of the Ottawas, and were marched by their new masters into the midst of the astonished Chippewas. While their captives slept, the 2 nations held a long conference, and the Ottawas were unfortunately persuaded to relinquish their grievance and return the prisoners to their former conquerors. The prospect for the Englishmen was now dark indeed, and several of them were to lose their lives that day. But as preparations were being made for the slaughter, Wawatam, Henry's adopted brother, walked into the council. By presents he bought the traitors, all the Indians recognizing his right to do so, and took him away with him into the interior. There, Henry spent the winter hunting with the Indians. He was often in danger from hostile tribes who brought tales of the siege of Detroit and summons from Pontiac to help in the war, but his position in the family of Wawatam protected him, and in the spring of 1764 he returned with a party of Canadian traders to Sault Ste. Marie. While Henry was at the Sault, a canoe arrived one day from Niagara. A council was assembled to meet the strangers and receive their message. They proved to be the ambassadors of Sir William Johnson, who warned the tribes of the great English army that was coming and advised them to hasten to Niagara to make peace. Such a weighty matter could not be settled by mere human knowledge and wisdom, so the Indians were made solemn preparations to consult their guiding spirit, the Great Turtle. They built a large wigwam within which they placed a small moose tent for the use of the priest. At nightfall the whole village assembled in the wigwam. Several fires had been kindled near the tent, and their flames lightened up the expectant faces of the strange assemblage. The priest entered the tent, and as the skins fell over him, many voices were heard. Some were barking like dogs, some howled like wolves, and others sobbed as if in pain. After a time, these frightful sounds died away, and a perfect silence followed. Then, a voice not heard before seemed to show the arrival of a new character in the tent. Henry described this as a low, feeble voice resembling the cry of a young puppy. When it was heard, the Indians clapped their hands for joy, for now the chief spirit, the turtle, the spirit that never lied, had come to them. The others had been evil and lying voices. For half an hour sounds of conversation were heard from the tent, and then the priest spoke, saying that the great turtle was come and would answer such questions as should be asked. The chief of the village desired the priest to inquire whether the English were prepared to make war on the Indians, and whether there were at Fort Niagara large numbers of English troops. When the priest put these questions, the tent began to shake violently, and soon a voice announced that the turtle had departed. A quarter of an hour elapsed in silence, and then the voice of the turtle was heard again. After it had talked for some time in a language unintelligible for the audience, the priest gave an interpretation of what it had said. The spirit had during its short absence crossed Lake Huron, been to Fort Niagara, and thence to Montreal. At Fort Niagara he had seen no great number of soldiers, but on the St. Lawrence he had found the river covered with boats, and the boats filled with soldiers, in numbers like the leaves of the trees, and these were coming to make war on the Indians. The chief had a third question to ask, and the spirit, without a fresh journey to Niagara, gave an immediate and most satisfactory answer. If, said the chief, the Indians visit Sir William Johnson, will they be received as friends? Sir William Johnson, said the spirit, will fill their canoes with presents, with blankets, kettles, guns, gunpowder and shot, and large barrels of rum, such as the stoutest of the Indians will not be able to lift, and every man will return in safety to his family. At this, writes Henry, the transport was universal, and amid the clapping of hands 100 voices exclaimed, "I will go too, I will go too." On the 10th of June, Henry embarked with the Indian deputation of 16 men, leaving the scene of his long captivity. The party went down Georgian Bay across the country where the great Huron mission had been built to Lake Simcoe, and out past the site of Toronto to Lake Ontario. There they built canoes to take the place of those they had left on Georgian Bay, completing 2 large boats in 2 days. They spent their last night encamped 4 miles from Fort Niagara. In the morning, the Indians feared to start, lest they should be going into a trap set by the English. Henry assured them of a friendly welcome, and at length, after painting themselves in their gayest colours to show their peaceable intent, and singing the song which they used on going into danger, they embarked. A few minutes after, says Henry, I crossed to the fort, and here I was received by Sir William Johnson, and in a matter for which I have ever been gratefully attached to his person and memory. The Indians joined in the great council, and Henry conferred with General Bradstreet, who, with 3,000 men, was preparing to go up Lake Erie and raise the siege of Detroit. Bradstreet informed him that it was his plan when he reached Detroit to send a body of troops to Mackinac, and that they should assist the traitor to recover his property there, should he care to accompany them. Henry was given command of a corps of Indians of the upper lake, 96 in number, who were to proceed with the army. Amongst them were the 16 men with whom he had come to Niagara. Henry comments on the reversal of condition which made him their leader. He, whose best hope it had very lately been to give through their forbearance. Most of the Indians promptly deserted, not caring to march against their own nation at Detroit, but Henry went on with Bradstreet and landed at Detroit on the 8th of August. He proceeded up Lake Huron with 2 companies of troops and 300 Canadian volunteers to Mackinac, where peace was concluded with the Indians, and the fort was reoccupied by English soldiers. Chapter 12. Wayne's Indian Campaign. With the turn of a single page of history and the passage of a single decade of time during this century of struggle for possession, the actors in the drama change, or if the same actor remain, a new set of circumstances makes them play a new part amid the old scene. Like the bits of glass in a kaleidoscope, they are shaken up and come out in new combinations, and with them our ideas and sympathies are shaken up and must be readjusted. We have followed the fortunes of the little English garrison at Detroit and Mackinac in their struggles against a horde of savages, and have breathed a sigh of relief when a strong British army came to rescue, and England once more resumed possession of her lake posts. We return to Detroit in 12 years to find General Hamilton, the British commander of the French-English town, reading with scorn the announcement in a stray copy of the Pennsylvania Gazette in July 1776. That a new American nation has been formed and a Declaration of Independence has been adopted. Within 2 years, Daniel Boone, the hero pioneer, is brought to Detroit, a British prisoner taken by Indians in their raid on Kentucky, and before he has made his escape from prison, Hamilton is chanting the war song and dancing the war dance at a grand council of Indians. To them, he is offering his congratulations on the success of their raids into the southern states of the newly formed Union, on the number of prisoners they have taken, and especially on the far greater number of scalps they have brought. The War of the Revolution has begun, and with it a period of bloodshed in the Northwest. While the main bodies of troops were being marshaled, and the decisive battles were being fought in the South and the East, the British carried on upon the West frontier an incessant Indian warfare. This border campaign was marked by a horrible series of bloody raids and massacres, many of which were planned at Niagara and Detroit. Niagara, wrested in the past from the Indians and the French, became at this time a place of refuge for the Loyalists of New York, a nest of Tories, and a center of British influence so strong that an American leader could make no more telling expression of his dread of the threatened loss of a southern point of vantage than to say that it must be saved. For if taken by the British, it would become another Niagara. From Detroit, Hamilton set out in the summer of 1778 with a force of 175 men to oust from Kaskaskia and Vincennes the American rebel George Rogers Clark, who had taken these British strongholds. But instead of returning to Detroit triumphant, Hamilton was taken by that same young rebel and started on a 1,200-mile journey to a Virginia prison. Even after this, it seemed to the Americans that plans and conspiracies came out from Detroit as fast as prisoners and scalps went into the British prison there. There were many schemes to take the fort, but all were abandoned because of its inaccessibility. When the negotiators met in Paris in 1782 to arrange terms of peace between Great Britain and the American colonies or states, it was difficult to decide what should be done with the Great Lakes. At first, it was suggested that the boundary line between the United States and Canada should be so drawn as to give the territory south of the Ottawa River and Lake Superior to the United States, as far west as the Mississippi. At another time, it was proposed that all of the land north of the Ohio and west of the Alleghenies should continue to be English. Finally, it was arranged that the Great Lakes, with the exception of Michigan, should form the boundary line between the United States and Canada in that part of the world. This arrangement gave to the United States the post at Detroit, Mackinac, and the other points on the lakes, but the English would not surrender them, justifying their not doing so on the ground that the Americans had broken the treaty in other respects. As long as the British retained the posts in the Northwest, the Indians of that region looked to them for support and were inclined to take up an attitude of hostility to the government of the United States and to colonists who now came into the Ohio Valley in great numbers. Treaties were made with them, but these the Indians failed to keep, and there ensured a period of confusion and bloodshed on the frontier. Into the details of this petty warfare it is not worth our while to enter. At first, the British seemed anxious to preserve peace for the sake of the fur trade, but as time went on, and relations between England and the United States became more strained, the English lent undisguised assistance to the Indians. It was inevitable that there should be constant strife between the rough and roaching frontiersmen who overstepped the original boundaries and the jealous, suspicious Indian who met all wrong by treachery and violence. The record of the years showed a succession of efforts for peace by the United States government and a series of councils, treaties, ruptures, and hostilities on the part of the Indians. A formal government had been organized in the Northwest by the Ordinance of 1787, which created the Northwest Territory, out of which were later formed the 5 states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. By 1789 and 1790, the United States government began to realize that it had to deal in this region with no petty skirmishes with scattered tribes, but with a widespread Indian uprising. Raids and counter-raids must be abandoned, and war with organized armies and carefully planned campaigns must be waged against the lawless hordes of savages who were breaking faith with the white man and murdering whom they pleased. An expedition under the leadership of General Harmer, set north in 1790 from Fort Washington, Cincinnati, met defeat at the hands of the Indians at the present Fort Wayne. A similar expedition, commanded a year later by General St. Clair, was routed on a battleground in central Ohio, and the whole frontier was terrorized. Matters had now become serious. Armies of regulars had been defeated by these savage masters of the art of treacherous warfare, and the Indians were becoming more and more aggressive in their elation at their victories, while the British were becoming more and more open to their support of the Lakes tribes. Needing a leader who could drive back the Indians, President Washington turned to a soldier who had distinguished himself in the Revolutionary War for hard fighting and daring bravery. Major General Anthony Wayne had so often snatched success in the face of almost certain defeat that he had earned for himself the nickname Mad Anthony. He was the grandson of a Pennsylvanian pioneer and had had hard schooling from his Indian fighting grandfather and father in the methods of frontier warfare. Above all else, he gloried in difficulty and danger. In April 1792, Washington appointed General Wayne to the command of the army and sent him to the Ohio to drill his men. Wayne found there the remnant of St. Clair's force, to which were being constantly added hundreds of raw recruits enlisted under new legislation for the campaign by Congress. The one stipulation that Wayne had made when he took command was that he be allowed to wait to fight until his ranks were full and his men thoroughly trained. He knew that he had to deal with the same kind of men who had failed St. Clair. He attributed this failure to poor organization and lack of military discipline. He knew, too, that he had the added difficulty of meeting the paralyzing discouragement caused by previous defeats and well-remembered scenes of horror. Patiently and deliberately he went to work, and new recruits arriving in the summer and autumn found themselves living in a camp where an army was being taught with all speed the essentials of warfare. By spring, Wayne had 2,500 soldiers who were eager for the campaign and worthy of their commander. Congress was reluctant to begin war and kept Wayne waiting all through the summer of 1793 while it made fruitless negotiations with the Indians. The tribes finally demanded that the Ohio River should be the boundary of American advance, and to this the government could not agree. In October, Wayne was given permission to open his campaign, but was cautious that on no account was he to run any risk of defeat. He moved his men from Fort Washington to a point 80 miles north, which he fortified as a winter camp and named Greenville in honor of his former comrade in arms, Captain Nathaniel Greene. Here he spent the winter, sending a large detachment of his men north to build on St. Clair's fatal battleground, a fort which was prophetically named Fort Recovery. Several skirmishes with the Indians took place at Greenville during the winter, and in the early summer a large war party made an unsuccessful attack on Fort Recovery. On the 27th of July, 1794, General Wayne started with his legion of troops, more than 2,000 men, for the Miami towns of northern Ohio. The march of the American army was watched with wonder and admiration by the Indians, who reported to the British that the soldiers went twice as far in a day as St. Clair's had done, that Wayne kept scouts out in every direction, and that he was always ready for attack, and guarded carefully against ambush by day or surprise by night. At the junction of the Maumee and Eoglies rivers, where the line of hostile Indian villages began, Wayne built a strong log stockade which he christened with the characteristic name of Fort Defiance, a name perpetuated to this day. Warned of his approach, the Indians had fled, leaving their homes and their rich fields of corn and vegetables, in which the soldiers reveled after their hard march and short rations. From Fort Defiance, Wayne sent a final offer of peace to the Indians, declaring that he would restore to them their land and villages and preserve their women and children from famine should they agree to a lasting peace. The Indians returned an evasive answer, and Wayne advanced against them. From scouts, he learned that the natives were encamped near the British fort on the Maumee River, a few miles west of the present city of Toledo. There were between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors in all, with 70 rangers from Detroit, the latter company being made up of French, English, and other refugees. On the 20th of August, Wayne met the Indians at a spot some 6 miles down the river, known as the Fallen Timbers, because there a whirlwind had overturned the forest and left the trees piled across one another in rows. Wayne's army numbered about 3,000 men, 2/3 of whom were regulars and 1/3 mounted volunteers from Kentucky, led by General Scott. At the front of the line was a small force of mounted volunteers, and back of them were the carefully placed lines of infantry and cavalry. The Indians were secreted as usual in the woods in tall grass and behind the piles of trees. From their shelter they poured a murderous fire into the ranks of the army, but the volunteers pressed on. The front line of infantry rushed up and dislodged the savages from their cover. The cavalry dashed over the rough ground and the piles of logs, and the Indians fled before the second line of soldiers could even come to the battlefields. Of the engagement, one of the men wrote that there was not a sufficiency of the enemy for the legion to play upon. The entire action lasted less than 40 minutes, and not a third of Wayne's force took part in it. The army pursued the fugitives 2 miles to the shelter of the British fort, and then burned everything nearby. 33 Americans were killed and 100 wounded in this engagement, which closed a 40 years' warfare with the Indians in as many minutes. Wayne's carefully drilled troops had won the most decisive victory ever gained over the Indians of the Northwest. General Wayne contemplated his conquest by marching back to Fort Recovery and thence westward to the Miami towns at the junction of St. Mary's and St. Joseph Rivers, the scene of Harmer's disaster. The Indians dared offer no resistance, but fled before his triumphant army. Along his route he burned their villages, and at the meeting place of the rivers he built the fort which was to perpetuate his name to the present day, Fort Wayne. Then he returned to Greenville for the winter. Meanwhile, the anger of the Indians had been stirred by the inaction of their British allies, who had urged them on to war, but had furnished no troops from Detroit. A new respect had been called forth for the Americans. All the winter Wayne received at Greenville delegations from various Indian tribes, and in the summer of 1795 a formal treaty was signed in which Wayne, representing the United States, made peace with all the western tribes. 1,130 Indians assembled, making a full representation from all tribes previously hostile. Gathered around the council fire and supplied with a pile of wampum strings, the chief and the American general conferred day after day as the various groups of Indians arrived during the months of June and July. The records of their speeches are 80 pages long, and carried one back to the day where Champlain and Frontenac conferred with the Indian children and received the repentant promise of good behavior in the future. But now Wayne was addressed by the chiefs as elder brother, and he called them always his younger brothers. By the Treaty of Greenville, the Indians ceded to the United States all of what is now southern Ohio and southeastern Indiana, various reservations about the fort of Detroit, Michilimackinac, and those which Wayne had built a 6-mile tract at Chicago, and a large grant of land near the falls of the Ohio. The government, in its turn, agreed to the Indian title to the remaining country and promised to pay the tribes large annuities. Both sides were to return all prisoners. Wayne, by his skill at warfare, had brought to the borders a peace that lasted for 15 years when new conditions brought new difficulties. While Wayne was fighting for the supremacy of the United States in the Northwest, John Jay was representing the government in London in negotiations for a treaty which should settle disputed points between the two nations, providing, among other things, for the settlement by a commission of any ambiguities in the boundaries and for the surrender of the lake posts to Americans. In 1796, this treaty was ratified by Congress, and American officers were sent to take command of the various posts. With appropriate ceremonies, the English flag was lowered and the American stars and stripes were raised at each of the posts whose history we have followed under French and later under English control. General Wayne was sent by a grateful Congress to conduct the final transfer of the forts. After a 1,200-mile journey, he arrived at Detroit, where he was received with great honor by Indians, English, French, and Americans. Leaving there in November for Presque Isle, he was taken with his old enemy, the Gout, and died at that place. His remains were later removed by his son to Philadelphia, but a log house patterned after the one which Wayne himself built there in 1790 marks today the place of his grave at the present city of Erie, Pennsylvania. It is worthy of note that the month before General Wayne started for Detroit to conclude the ceremonies of taking possession of that post, Moses Cleveland, with a party of Connecticut pioneers, set out to found on the shores of Lake Erie the city which bears his name, the advance guard of an army of occupation, with the stipulations of the Treaty of Greenville and Wayne's intimidation of the Indians made possible. Chapter 13. The Great Lakes in the War of 1812. From the surrender of the Northwest Post and the founding of Cleveland to the year 1812, there is little to note in the history of the Great Lakes. The forts were gradually strengthened, the fur trade was continued, and a few settlements were made on the southern shores of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. Travel and transportation between the Atlantic seaboard and the Great Lakes were so difficult that few settlers found their way into the lake region, and there was no market for such agricultural products as were raised. In the same period, the Ohio Valley was fast filling up, and settlers were pushing westward and northward from the Ohio River into central Ohio and Indiana. The ever-increasing pressure on the Indians of that region aroused their fears and resentment, and made them listen to the plans of an able chieftain, Tecumseh, who band them together in a strong league for resistance to the whites. The natives looked for aid to the British in Canada, but how far these had gone in encouraging the Indians was unknown. In 1811, matters became so serious that General William Henry Harrison, governor of Indiana Territory, marched against the Indians and defeated them in the Battle of Tippecanoe. When the war in 1812 began, Tecumseh and many of his allies joined the British. The opening of the war found the lake frontier of the United States exposed and almost unprotected. At Fort Wayne, there were 85 soldiers, at Fort Harrison, 50, at Fort Dearborn, 53, at Fort Mackinac, 88, and at Detroit, 120. The last name post claimed early attention because of its great importance and also because of its exposed situation. Its loss to the United States would mean the loss of the upper lakes, at least temporarily. The problem was a difficult one because the United States had no war vessels on the lake to secure communication between Detroit and the settlements on the southeastern shore of Lake Erie. William Huff, governor of Michigan Territory, fully recognized the importance of a naval force, but he was obliged to do what he could to defend Detroit without one. In the spring of 1812, with 3 regiments of Ohio militia, a troop of dragoons, and a regiment of United States infantry, in all about 1,600 men, he set out from the settlements in Ohio to march overland to reinforce this important post. The route lay through the wilderness, much of the way over swampy grounds, but the soldiers cut roads and advanced with a rapidity that amazed the British. At Frenchtown, on the River Raisin, 40 miles below Detroit, Hull received word that war had been declared. Before this, he had sent a schooner to Detroit with supplies and a letter to the commandant apprising him of his coming. This vessel was seized by the British soldiers stationed at Malden, on the Canadian side of the Detroit River, in some distance below the American town. On the 5th of July, 1812, Hull reached Detroit. Beside its small garrison, the town contained about 800 inhabitants. It was defensible from Indian attacks, but was within gunshot of the British side of the Detroit River, was insufficiently supplied with provisions and ammunition for a siege, and was liable to be completely cut off from communication with the United States should the British gain command of Lake Erie and the road along the river to the south. At once, Hull seized the town of Sandwich, opposite Detroit, and issued a proclamation to the inhabitants of Canada which brought many of them over to the American side. But an expedition which was to have reinforced him from Niagara came to naught. On the British side, in the spring of 1812, affairs seemed even more gloomy, but the difficulties were overcome by the capability and courage of one man, Brigadier General Isaac Brock, who exercised entire command in Upper Canada. He had at his disposal barely 2,000 men, who were hundreds of miles from their supplies and scattered through several posts. When war seemed imminent, Brock fitted out armed vessels on Lake Erie and strengthened the defense of Malden. The moment war was declared, he directed a subordinate to seize the American post at Michilimackinac, and himself hurried with all available men to the Detroit River. Day after day, the American army waited at Sandwich before striking a decisive blow at the British in their fort at Malden. General Hull had indeed good reason for fear of failure, for although he had more men than the British, the English army had in its fortification a base of attack, and in its fleet a pronounced advantage. With ineffective sallies into the neighboring country and prolonged council of war, the day wore on, and the officers as well as the rank and file of the army became more and more disheartened. They had crossed the river July 12th. They finally set August 8th for the attack on Malden, but meanwhile word came that British reinforcements were on their way to the fort, and that a party of Indians under Tecumseh had captured the American supplies and mailbags coming from Ohio. Prisoners of war from Fort Mackinac arrived at the American camp, announcing that their fort had been surrendered and that a horde of Indians were coming from the northwest to attack Detroit in the rear. With the British garrison at Malden increased, Detroit threatened by the Indians, and the line of communication between the American army and headquarters in danger. Hull saw nothing to do but to recross the river, and on the night of the day when he had planned to attack the British fort, he withdrew with his force to Detroit. Meanwhile, General Brock reached Malden, held a council of war at which Tecumseh, with his following of 1,000 Indians, was present, and sent to General Hull a summons to surrender. Hull refused to yield, and started messengers to recall an expedition of 350 men, which he has dispatched under 2 Ohio colonies. MacArthur and Lewis cast to the River Raisin to rescue the necessary supplies for the army. As soon as Hull's reply was received, 2 British vessels moved up the river to Sandwich, where their guns could cover the American fort. During the night, Tecumseh and 600 Indians crossed to the American side of the river and established themselves in the woods at a point where they could intercept the returning Ohio colonies with their force. On the morning of August 16th, General Brock crossed the river with 700 soldiers. The British commander had intended to take up a position and force Hull to attack him, but after he reached the American bank of the river, he learned from Tecumseh that the Ohio detachment was only a few miles away. Fearing lest he be surrounded if he delay, Brock determined to make an immediate attack. Within his tent, General Hull sat debating what to do. Should he admit to his officers and men his desire to surrender at once? Their undistinguished scorn at his previous delays would perhaps turn to open mutiny, yet he felt sure that the fort must ultimately be taken, and he dreaded the loss of life and possible Indian massacre should he hold out. The British column began to advance. Every soldier expected that the heavy American guns, which were pointing towards them, would be lighted and discharged into their midst. Instead, an American was seen advancing from the fort with a white flag. Within an hour, and without the firing of a single shot, the surprised British troops found themselves in possession of Detroit. Hull included in the terms of capitulation not only the troops within the fort, but the Ohio detachment now advancing up the river, so that General Brock gained at least 2,500 prisoners of war. The mortification of the country at the whole course of the war vented itself after this surrender upon General Hull, who was really the victim of poor management of the army and lack of support at headquarters. He might have been forced to give up Detroit within a few weeks unless he was reinforced, but he could have kept Brock from returning to Harry Niagara in 9 days. Detroit was surrounded on the morning of August 16th. On the same day and at the same hour, Fort Dearborn at Chicago was being burned by an Indian war party, after the members of its garrison had been massacred. 2 weeks earlier, Hull had sent an order to Captain Heald, commander of the fort, to evacuate it if practicable. The Indian runner reached Fort Dearborn on August 9th with this message and with the news of the fall of Fort Mackinac, the receipt of which had been the occasion of Hull's decision in regards to Chicago. It had taken the Indian messenger a suspiciously long time to make the journey, and as Indians from a distance began to gather about the fort, it was surmised that he had in some way learned the contents of the message, and in the particular clause which directed that Captain Heald deliver up to the Indians all the public property of the garrison, and had told the news along the way. Accounts differ as to what Captain Heald promised to the Indians. According to the story of Mr. Kinsey, a trader in the fort, Captain Heald held a council with them at which he agreed to divide amongst them the public property at the fort on condition that they should furnish him with a friendly escort. Unfortunately, the 2 things that the Indians most wanted were ammunition and liquor. These the white men considered it an act of madness to put into their hands, and under cover of night knocked in the heads of the barrels and poured the whiskey into the river, threw powder, bags of shot, and cartridges into the river, and breaking to pieces the muskets and pistols they could not take with them, dropped them into a well. An unknown writer, who was present at the time, distinctly states that Heald objected to this act and argued that it was a bad thing to lie to an Indian. The watchful Indians found out what had been done, and from that time on, the older chiefs were unable to restrain the anger of their young men. So many Indians had gathered that the officers became convinced that the tribes had been notified by the messenger from Detroit as he made his trip of the distribution of gifts that was to take place. The supply of blankets, paints, calicoes, and trinkets that were given out did not satisfy the warriors. On the evening of the 13th of August, the garrison was cheered by the arrival from Fort Wayne of Captain William Wells, a famous Indian fighter and uncle of Mrs. Heald, the commander's wife. This man had had a most romantic life. Born in Kentucky, he had been stolen when a boy of 12 by the Indians and adopted by a chief of the Miamis whose daughter he had married. He had grown up with the Indians and fought their battles with them as a matter of course, taking part in the engagements with General Harmer and General St. Clair. Discovered by his Kentucky kindred and convinced he was a brother of Captain Samuel Wells, he had been persuaded after a time to return to his own people. He had bidded his Indian father-in-law a dramatic farewell, telling him that in the past they had been friends, but henceforth they must be enemies. But as a matter of fact, he had always kept in friendly relation with his former chief, and had on one occasion saved his family from being taken prisoners. He had been one of Wayne's most valuable scouts, and had since occupied the position of Indian agent, first at Chicago and now at Fort Wayne, where he was living with his Indian wife. Hearing of the probable evacuation of Fort Dearborn, he had marched thither with all haste, bringing a party of 30 friendly Miamis, in the hopes that he could be of assistance to his friends, and especially to his favorite niece, Mrs. Heald. On the morning of the 15th of August at 9 o'clock, the soldiers left the fort for their journey of 280 miles to Detroit. Without a sign of ill feeling, the Indians bade them goodbye, and the little party started along the lake shore. Captain Wells, with half his Miamis, all mounted on Indian ponies, led the line. The soldiers of the garrison, with the wagons in which sat the 12 women and 20 children, followed directly behind them, and the remainder of the friendly Miamis brought up the rear. The escort of 500, furnished by the neighboring tribes, kept abreast of the troops until they reached the sand hills, a quarter mile from the fort. There they struck out suddenly into the prairie and disappeared, hurrying forward to prepare an ambuscade. The little company had proceeded about a mile and a half when Captain Wells was seen to turn and ride back, swinging his hat in a circle above his head, which in the sign language of the frontier meant, "We are surrounded by Indians." As he came nearer, he shouted, "We are surrounded. March upon the sand ridges." All at once, in the language of Mrs. Heald, who left a graphic report, they saw Indians' heads sticking up and down again here and there like turtles out of water. As the member of the party most experienced in Indian warfare, Captain Wells was immediately put in command. He led the men in a charge up the bank, and with a volley of shot they broke the line of the Indians. A second time they charged, and again the Indians drew back. But though they were beaten in front, they poured in from all sides, captured the horses and baggage, and began to kill the women and children. For 15 or 20 minutes the fight went on. Captain Wells was here, there, and everywhere. With 2 pistols and a gun, which he kept reloading with lightning rapidity, he sighted and brought down the warriors in the midst of their wanton work. Wounded himself and isolated on a mound with a remnant of his men, Captain Heald saw that there was no hope but to surrender. The Indians made signs from him to approach them, but he offered to surrender in the hope of sparing further bloodshed. His own wife was slightly wounded, and Mrs. Helm, the wife of his lieutenant, had only been saved from being tomahawked by the friendly chief, Black Partridge, who seized her from the grasp of her captor and took her to the water, where he made feint to drown her, but kept her head out until the fight was over. After the surrender, Captain Wells rode up, desperately wounded, to send farewell messages to his wife, and was killed on the instant by a group of Indians who mangled his body horribly. Of the 93 in the party, but 36 were still living. Of the 66 fighting men, 43 had been killed, and only 7 women and 6 children survived. Some of the prisoners made their escape, finding their way to safety through a series of hairbreadth adventures. Some died in captivity, and others were exchanged at intervals during the next 2 years. On the spot where the massacre took place, then out in open prairie, now at the foot of 18th Street in the city of Chicago, there stands a noble monument to the Fort Dearborn garrison. With Fort Dearborn and Fort Mackinac abandoned, the last American defenses on the western lakes were gone. The boundary line of the United States became the Wabash and Maumee rivers, and the surrender of Detroit made it doubtful whether even that line could be maintained. The hold of the United States on the Great Lakes in August 1812 looked very uncertain. Chapter 14. The Conquest of Lake Erie. The year 1813 began with another disaster for the United States. After the surrender of Detroit, Governor William Henry Harrison of the Indiana Territory placed himself at the head of a popular movement to retrieve the defeat at any cost and to recover Detroit. It was winter before he succeeded in getting an army within reach of the lake coast. For months, the 3 divisions of his force of 10,000 men struggled through the swampy lands of Ohio, where the movement of troops and of necessary provisions was rendered well nigh impossible by the heavy rains. On the 15th of January, 2 Frenchmen had entered the camp of the advanced division of the army, which under command of General Winchester was establishing itself at a point on the Maumee River, 20 miles inland from Lake Erie. They urged the troops to occupy Frenchtown, a village on the American shore of Lake Erie, but within British lines. This town on the River Raisin was held by Canadians and Indians, and its loss, if taken by the Americans, would be a serious blow to the British. 650 men, the flower of the Kentucky regiments, started under the command of Colonel Lewis for the attack. After considerable losses, the Americans seized the town. General Winchester hastened to their support with 300 more men, making a total American force at the River Raisin of 800 or 900 men. General Proctor, Brock's successor at Fort Malden, had under his command over 2,000 soldiers. On the morning of January 22, 1813, he crossed the lake on the ice with a force of 600 men and from 600 to 800 Indians and attacked the Americans in the ill-fortified village. When the hard-fought engagement was ended, 400 Americans were missing, either killed during the battle by the British or scalped by the Indians in the horrible massacre that followed the defeat. Only after the ammunition had given out and retreat had been proved impossible because of the deep snow and the position of the enemy, did the last of the gallant Kentuckians surrender. "Remember the river raisin" became the watchword of a desperate people, and operations on the Great Lakes were suspended until Commodore Perry was ready with his navy to retrieve these defeats and turn the tide of American fortune. Oliver Hazard Perry had been brought up in the naval service. His father was a gallant seaman who had fought in the Revolution and been on the sea ever since. When Oliver was ready, he was appointed midshipman on his father's ship, and had seen since that day service in the West Indies, in the Tripolitan War, and off the Atlantic coast. At the beginning of the War of 1812, he was put in charge of a flotilla of gunboats stationed at Newport, but he had petitioned to be removed from this retirement and placed in active service, preferably on the lakes. He was summoned in the winter of 1813 to take charge of the construction of vessels on Lake Erie. He found the lake fleet divided. At the Black Rock Navy Yard on the Niagara River lay several vessels, unable to get out past the British fleet and the overlooking British forts. At Erie, Pennsylvania, 2 brigs, a schooner, and a gunboat were being built. It was for Perry to unite the 2 sections of the fleet, to provide them with a crew of able seamen, and to force the British fleet into decisive action. An American victory on the Niagara River on the 27th of May set free the vessels at Black Rock. Perry was on hand to superintend their laborious removal of the Navy Yard. Oxen and men worked day after day, dragging the vessels against the heavy current of the river into Lake Erie. Once on the waters of the lake, the American ships under Perry's command evaded the British cruises, which were sailing back and forth between Niagara and Erie, with the sole purpose of intercepting them, and he reached the latter port in safety. For 2 months the fleet lay in that harbor while Perry strained every nerve to get the vessels into shape and secure sailors to man them. We get a little idea of his difficulties by the fact that between the last of May and the 1st of August, he cut down his requirements in the number of seamen to 1/2 his original estimate. On the 6th day of August, all preparations were completed, and the fleet sailed out on Lake Erie. Commodore Perry was 28 years old. His antagonist, Barclay, was 32. Barclay had met as many difficulties as Perry in getting his fleet ready, and especially in securing provisions for his men. The American squadron had moreover cut off communication between Fort Malden and its source of supplies, so in September, even though his best vessel, the Detroit, had to be launched unfinished from the stocks, Barclay saw no choice but to fight at once. Early on the morning of September 9th, the British fleet sailed to meet the American squadron, which was anchored at the mouth of the Sandusky River. Barclay had 6 vessels with 63 guns and probably about 450 men. Perry had 9 vessels with 54 guns and about the same number of available men. His guns, however, were much heavier and his vessels larger. At daybreak of September 10th, Perry's lookout discovered the approaching British fleet. The American ships at once weighed anchor in 12 minutes. They were under sail and standing toward the enemy. The wind was light and the lake calm, so that both sides found difficulty in getting into position, but by noon they were drawn up for battle. The British vessels were in a single column, the Americans in a somewhat more irregular formation, and each vessel opposed one of its own tonnage and build in the enemy's fleet. Barclay commanded the Detroit, a ship of 490 tons carrying 19 guns, and opposite him was Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, with 20 guns. At 12:15, the British opened fire, and the Americans replied. Finding the British fire at long range very destructive, especially to his own vessel, Perry set more sail and passed the world by hail of trumpet for the whole line to close up and advance nearer the enemy. For 2 hours the fleets maneuvered in this position. The Lawrence within 250 yards of the Detroit, and both vessels pouring a heavy fire into each other. A second vessel, the Queen Charlotte, came to the support of Barclay and Perry's flagship. After sustaining the action for over 2 hours, was seriously disabled. Every gun was rendered useless, the greater part of the crew killed or wounded, and the rigging shot away. At 2:30, the English commander saw the Lawrence drop from her position, and a small boat pass from her to the Niagara, a vessel under command of Lieutenant Elliot, which had been at some distance from the main engagement and was at this time comparatively fresh. As Barclay wrote in his official report, the American Commodore, seeing that as yet the day was against him, made a noble and, alas, too successful an effort to regain it, for he bore up in the Niagara, and, supported by his small vessels, passed within pistol shot and took a ranking position on our bow. Up to this time, the result of the action had been in doubt. For some reason, the portion of the fleet under Elliot had pursued an independent course, and Perry, with the vessel nearest him, had been too hard pressed. A bitter dispute as to the cause of this condition was waged by Elliot's friends in the ensuing years after the close of the war. Whatever the reason, it was evident to all the American force was not in its most effective position because so many of the vessels were fighting a long range instead of at close. When Elliot came up near enough to the disabled flagship to allow Perry to go on board, the advantage was for the first time on the American side. Perry was able to bear down on the Detroit and pour into her volleys of shot so that with American vessels on every side aiding in his attack, she soon became completely disabled. The topmasts and rigging were cut away, the hull was shattered, and the vessel became unmanageable. Within half an hour, the British commander was forced to strike his flag and surrender. It had been a desperate alternative for Commodore Perry to venture into a small boat and transfer his flag from one ship to another. By his personal action, in thus rushing his own vessel in at the crisis and exposing himself to a fusillade from the enemy for several minutes before he could make any reply to it, Perry had won the battle for the Americans. He determined to receive the surrender on his original flagship, the Lawrence, at whose peak had been flying throughout the battle the words spoken a few months before by the hero for whom the vessel was named, the dying commander of the Chesapeake. "Don't give up the ship." Perry returned to the ship, and the English officers came to him there. Each presented his sword, and in reply Perry bowed and requested that their side arms be retained by the officers. The deck of the Lawrence was covered with dead and wounded. On both sides the battle had been very hard fought, and the loss of life, both of officers and men, was very heavy. One of 103 men on the Lawrence, 22 had been killed, and 61 wounded. On both the flagships, every officer, save Perry, was killed or wounded, even Barclay being seriously injured, and the loss on these vessels was probably 4/5 of the men disabled or killed. When the ceremony of surrender was over, Perry tore off the back of an old letter, and using his hat for a writing desk, wrote to General Harrison, stationed with reinforcement on the Sandusky River, "We have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop." Perry's victory was immediately followed up both by him and by General Harrison. Within a week, the remnant of the fleet was ready to convey land forces to Malden, where they disembarked on the 27th of September. The timidity and incompetence of the British General Proctor gave the Americans a great advantage. To the utter scorn of Tecumseh and his Indians, who were supporting the British, General Proctor evacuated Malden, Detroit, and Sandwich without a stroke in their defense, and retired along the road to Lake Ontario even before the Americans landed. With such a start, Harrison thought that the English, with their 1,000 horses, would be out of his reach, but he prepared to follow them. This Proctor seems not to have included in the range of possibilities. By easy marches, the British proceeded to Chatham, 50 miles from Sandwich on the River Thames. Here, Proctor halted the army while he himself went on to the Moravian town 26 miles beyond. The American army appeared, and the British tried to follow the commander to Chatham. The organization of the whole army was by this time completely demoralized. They had, however, no choice but to turn and fight, as the young officers and soldiers had long desired. The British were so stationed as to give the advantage of position to their opponents, and the American force was strengthened by a mounted regiment commanded by Richard Johnson, who had won a great reputation for himself and his men in previous battles on the frontier. The Americans lost only 15 men in the engagement, with 30 wounded. The British list of dead and wounded was also short, but nearly 500 were taken prisoners, and their supply of provisions and ammunition fell into the hands of the Americans. Only 200 of this whole division of the British Army returned to report at headquarters a month later. The Indian warrior Tecumseh was killed in this battle, and with his death the remote prospect of an Indian confederacy was gone. After these two victories, the Western Indians fell away from their alliance with the British and took no active part in the war. The last year of the war, the year 1814, was marked by constant and active operations on Lake Ontario and about Niagara. The naval movements were not particularly effective on the American side, nor did they win great results. The possession of the Niagara River was sharply contested, and the American troops distinguished themselves by their bravery at the battles of Chippewa Creek and Lundy's Lane. Cut off from any other lake position, the British could concentrate their forces at this point and throw the Americans on the defense. These battles concerned, nevertheless, only a small portion of the Great Lakes, which were again the northern boundary of the United States. By Perry's victory on Lake Erie, the subsequent recovery of the Detroit River, and the defeat of the British Army at the Thames, Lake Erie and the whole Northwest were saved to the United States. The close of the war by the Treaty of Ghent in the winter of 1814 brought to the lake frontier a well-earned and lasting peace. Chapter 15, General Lewis Cass and the Reorganization. A period of conflict always leaves behind its changed and unsettled conditions. Between the close of a war and the final readjustment of affairs leading up to a settled and permanent life, there must be a time of reorganization. Into this period of reconstruction, the Western Territory about the Great Lakes passed at the close of the War of 1812. Since the Ordinance of 1787, the Northwest Territory had been subdivided. Ohio had become a state in 1802, and the region west of it had all been included in a territory under the general name of Indiana, of which section William Henry Harrison was the first governor. From Indiana, in its turn, Michigan was set off in 1805 with William Hull as its first governor. On Hull's retirement from public life after the surrender of Detroit, Colonel Lewis Cass was appointed governor of Michigan Territory. As the man who had most influence on the Northwest during these years of Reconstruction, Governor Cass deserves detailed notice. Born in Exeter, New Hampshire in 1782, Lewis Cass was the son of a soldier of the Revolution. During his son's boyhood, Major Cass, the father, was with Anthony Wayne or in command of Fort Hamilton, and after the Peace of Greenville he brought his family, as did so many of the soldiers, to the rich country through which he had marched in wartime. The young man divided his time between Marietta, where he began the study of law, and the frontier where his father was hewing a home and making a living out of the wilderness. Under the state constitution of Ohio, the first certificate of admission to the bar was given in 1802 to Lewis Cass. In the school of the county court, the young lawyer gained a first-hand knowledge of the practice of the law and an understanding of the people of the frontier and how to deal with them, both of which served him well in his governorship. Even before he reached the proper age of eligibility, he was sent to the Ohio legislature, and at the outbreak of the War of 1812, he was given a colonel's commission. Cass was one of the 3 Ohio colonels who served with Hull in the ill-starred Detroit expedition. Indeed, he led one of the few successful minor charges of that campaign. To his great indignation, he was included by his general in that surrender, although he was not at the fort. For some month, he was prisoner of war on parole. As soon as he was released, he joined Harrison, under whom he did such efficient service that Harrison left him after the Battle of the Thames in command of Detroit and the northwest frontier. The president soon appointed Cass governor of Michigan Territory, which then included only the lower peninsula of the present state, but to which the territory that is now Wisconsin was added in 1818 under the name of the Huron District. Indiana became a state 2 years after the close of the war, but as governor of Michigan Territory and superintendent of Indian affairs, General Cass had control of all Indian posts in the Northwest, as well as of the whole of Michigan, Wisconsin, and northern Illinois. Illinois became a state in 1818, but at that time the only recognized settlements were in the southern portion of the territory, and the region about Chicago was practically left to the care of General Cass. The management of this vast territory presented many difficulties. The governor's immediate residence, Detroit, was 4/5 Canadian, and of this population a large proportion was French. It was only 50 years since Major Gladwin had taken possession of a Detroit that was wholly French, and when the Americans took command in 1796, they had found a large predominance of French Canadians. These settlers were in the best of times poor farmers, and in war times they had stopped all attempts to cultivate the land. Governor Cass found among them the most absolute ignorance of the rudimentary principles of farming that he had ever encountered. They used one piece of ground without the least attempt to fertilize until it was exhausted and then proceeded to another. As these settlers of Detroit were typical of the most scattered inhabitants of the region, and as the Indians were almost entirely dependent on the gifts and supplies of the ruling people, Cass found himself confronted by the problem of how to feed a starving territory. For its immediate need, he sought and obtained government boundaries for the people. For the remedy of the condition, he did everything in his power to stimulate settlement, urging the government to survey the land and allot portions for sale. In this, he was hindered by the false reports of the first surveyors, who for some reason represented the whole of Michigan as so swampy, barren, or otherwise unfit for cultivation that there could be no incentive to immediate settlement. This, be it remembered, was said of Michigan, whose rich bottom lands, fertile prairies, and timber tracts were soon to be so productive and whose orchards were to become among the greatest fruit producers of the states. Cass did everything in his power to counteract these statements and to further immigration. Occupation of the land by 30 settlers would solve the difficulties by making the inhabitants independent as they became capable of producing what they needed, and would also lessen their isolation by creating lines of communication with the East. In these efforts he was successful. A public sale of lands was held in 1818, and by 1820 the population had nearly doubled since before the war. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 brought in a period of rapid immigration in which Cass began to see the fulfillment of his hopes. The population jumped from 9,000 in 1820 to 32,000 in 1830. This came just before he was called to the position of Secretary of War at Washington. During his period of national service, he had the satisfaction of seeing his territory flooded with newcomers, till in 1837 it entered the Union as a state with 175,000 inhabitants. It was due to the statesmanship of its governor that Michigan Territory was so well ordered and well developed a region and was therefore so soon ready for statehood. He educated the original settlers to self-government, organized courts and legislative assemblies, and guided their policies and furthered the cause of public education. During the 18 years of his governorship, he devoted himself to such service with a zeal that won immediate results. In his double position as governor and superintendent of Indian affairs, Cass did much else for the Western Lake region. Even after the cessation of hostilities, he found the British attitude hostile and aggravating. This showed itself in two ways. The British were inclined to ignore the rights of the United States citizens and to interfere with their liberty when the proximity of the two nations brought up any disputed question. They also stirred the Indians to hostility. Governor Cass stood out boldly, insisting that the United States must be treated according to the customs of international law between two equal powers. In time, the British came to realize that they were dealing with a nation, not with a detached and feeble territory. Governor Cass could not handle so openly the British instigation of the Indians to hostility towards the United States and its western settlers. There was no law to prevent the distribution of 60 tons of presents among the Indians who gathered at Malden from the American as well as from the Canadian side of the river. The British did not realize the time had come for them to give up their guardianship of all Indian tribes who did not live within their lawful jurisdiction. In the conduct of Indian affairs, Governor Cass showed himself skilled as no leader had been since the day of the wise French explorers. The Indians had never forgotten the French missionaries 7 generations, said a Chippewa chief, have passed since the Frenchmen came to these falls, Sault Ste. Marie, but we have not forgotten them, very just were they to us. This spirit of fairness now returned in Governor Cass, who combined with it an insight into Indian character, a patience that enabled him to deal with the savages, and an energy which made him go to endless trouble to arrange matters with them. The work of this wonderful man held off raids and massacres, if not open and continued war, which would have retarded settlement in this exposed wilderness for many years. If the white men were to occupy the greater part of the country, agreements must be made and kept with the Indians. Cass recognized this as his cardinal principle and began to act on it even before the close of the war. He first made treaties with the Indians near Detroit. From this center the circle widened until it included the whole of his vast territory and parts of more settled regions. At St. Mary's in Ohio, at Saginaw in Michigan, and at Chicago in Illinois, he concluded treaties which brought to the United States vast stretches of valuable territory. With the permission of the government, Cass organized an expedition to go into the remote sections of its northwest possessions, investigate their resources, and come into friendly relation with the Indians. Of this picturesque and important expedition made by 20 Americans into the then unknown Lake Superior country, Mr. Schoolcraft, one of his scientific companions, has left us a full account. In every transaction, the figure of Cass stands out strong and forceful. At Sault Ste. Marie, he wanted to obtain a piece of ground which, through old British and French treaties, the Indians had previously admitted to belong to the white men. Adorned with British medals, the Indians greeted him with an independence of word and gesture that soon became open rudeness and impudence. Retiring from the council, the chiefs ran up the British flag on their lodge and cleared the room in preparation for battle. Governor Cass, with a single interpreter, walked into the Indian camp, tore down the British flag, and faced the astonished savages. The Americans were studious, he said, to render justice and promote peace with the Indians, but the flag was the distinguishing token of national power, and two could not fly over the same spot. The Indians were forbidden to raise any flag but the American, and if they should, the United States would put strong feet on their neck and crush them to earth. With these words, he turned and walked out of the lodge with the British flag in his hand. In a few hours, the Indians signed the treaty, and the expedition proceeded on its way. At the request of Cass, mineralogists and geologists had been sent with him, and they made discoveries, as he had expected, of copper and other minerals. So valuable were they that the attention of the whole United States were turned towards the rich region. Part of the company, led by Cass, returned by way of Chicago, a village of only 10 or 12 houses outside the limits of a well-garrisoned fort, but with a location in what seemed to Cass the most fertile and beautiful country that could be imagined. 6 years later, Cass was back on Lake Superior, making on the site of Duluth important treaties with the tribes of Wisconsin and Minnesota. In all these treaties with the Indians, he insisted on 3 points. The chiefs should understand fully what they were doing, just remuneration should be made by the Americans, and the promises made should be faithfully observed on both sides. The flag that he carried into the lake region remained during his administration the symbol of justice and honor and won the respect of all. Chapter 16: The Black Hawk War. The settlement of northern Illinois and Wisconsin by American colonists brought on in 1832 the last serious Indian outbreak in the lake region. The white men had been pushing the Indians farther and farther west. On the banks of the Mississippi, the red men turned and made a desperate attempt to keep possession of the lands which held the homes and the graves of their ancestors. Between Rock River in Illinois and the Wisconsin River, there lay on the eastern banks of the Mississippi a region which had been known to the white men ever since the visit of Nicholas Parrott in 1690 because of its extensive deposits of lead. Mines had been worked there by the Indians and Frenchmen for 2 centuries and had yielded a considerable output which had been bought by French-Canadian traders and in later years by the British. The United States concluded in 1804 a treaty with the Sauk and Fox Indians, who occupied this country, by which they ceded to the Americans the territory east of the Mississippi River from the mouth of the Illinois at the south to the mouth of the Wisconsin at the north. It had been agreed that so long as the lands remained the public property of the United States, the Indians might live and hunt there, but when they were bought by settlers, the Indians must move. American mining settlements sprang up after the close of the war in 1812, and by 1827 an established coach road, known as Kellogg's Trail, ran from Peoria 120 miles north to Galena, which was in the heart of the mining country. Along this road were occasional groups of cabins, while on either side trails ran off into the wilderness which would have led the travelers who followed them to solitary homesteads and well-ordered farms. In a rich and fertile tract at the mouth of Rock River stood the chief village of the Sauks. It was one of the largest and most prosperous Indian towns on the continent, with more than 500 families, and was besides the principal cemetery of the nation. Squatters seized the Indian fields, built their huts on their clearings, and stole their harvests. Until the lands were formally sold, the Indian had a right there, and their complaints were just. In 1828, however, the site of the village was sold and the tribes were given notice to leave. Keokuk, the chief of the Sacs, crossed the Mississippi with the majority of the tribe and counseled the rest to yield peaceably. A considerate number of the Indians remained in the settlement, living on the high bluff which has since been known as Black Hawk's Watchtower, and cultivating the few fields which remained to them. Black Hawk was one of the Indians who did not share Keokuk's submissive temper of mind. He was a warrior about 60 years of age who seemed always to have a restless and discontented member of the tribe. He was a tall, spare man with pinched features, high cheekbones, and a prominent Roman nose. His black eyes were piercing, he had practically no eyebrows, and his hair had been plucked out save for a single scalp lock, in which on occasion was fastened a bunch of eagle feathers. He was a striking figure, and his history bore out in interest his appearance. He had begun his warlike career in early youth. Before he was 15, he had won in his tribe the rank of a brave, and at that age the scalping of an enemy had gained him the coveted right to paint, to wear feathers, and to dance the war dance. Since that time he had been involved in every tribal skirmish and had taken place, and he had played a prominent part in the white men's wars. In the unsettled period before the War of 1812, Black Hawk had gathered about him a group of 200 young warriors who won for themselves in the war the name of the British Band for their support of the British troops. He had fought at the Battle of Frenchtown on the River Raisin, at the Battle of the Thames under Tecumseh, and after the latter's death he returned to Illinois and carried on there a border warfare which was only ended by his signing at St. Louis in 1816 a treaty of peace. Since that time he had made the Rock River village his headquarters, and when the white men began to take up his land, his smoldering hatred for the Americans blazed out. Returning with a band of warriors from the winter hunting season of 1831, he was warned off his land. He refused to cross the Mississippi River and appealed to the Indians to defend the graves of their ancestors. In spite of Keokuk's remonstrances, the best young men of the Sauk and Fox tribes flocked to his standard, and his threats excited such alarm amongst the settlers that Governor Reynolds of Illinois issued a call for volunteers to assist the regular troops in guarding the frontier. There was a prompt response, and when the troops reached Black Hawk's village, the Indians withdrew during the night to the west side of the river and signed a treaty never to return to their former homes without the express permission of the United States authorities. Black Hawk did not abide by this treaty. During the winter of 1832, he recruited a large force, and in the spring he crossed the Mississippi at a point just south of his former village and began to march up the Rocky River Valley. This invasion of the state by a hostile band of savages excited great alarm along the frontier. The settlers came in from their lonely farms and built about the larger farms, villages, stockades, and defenses. A call for volunteers was issued, and the enthusiastic response was a surprise even to the governor who summoned them. One of the first to enlist was Abraham Lincoln, an Illinois citizen of 2 years' standing. He had come with his family in his 7th year from Kentucky to Indiana, and thence in 1830 to the newer settlements of Illinois. He was 23 years old and was a tall, sturdy backwoodsman, who was to prove himself in the wrestling matches that were the soldiers' pastime, the strongest man but one in the whole army. He was at once chosen captain of his company, an honor which brought him more gratification than most of his greater successes. The volunteers were organized into 4 regiments and started to follow Black Hawk up the Rock River. The command of 400 regulars was given to Colonel Zachary Taylor, afterwards President of the United States, and during the months of this war there served in the army Robert Anderson, the defender of Sumter, Winfield Scott, Albert Sidney Johnston, the Confederate hero, and Jefferson Davis. It was a distinguished group of men who responded in their youth to the call of their country. The marching was difficult. There were no roads or bridges, only marshy trails and streams, swollen into torrents by the spring thaws. But the hardy backwoodsmen were used to such conditions. They marched steadily on, and when they had gone some 90 miles up Rock River to Dixon's Ferry, halted to await the arrival of General Atkinson with the regular troops and the loads of provisions. They found there 2 battalions of horsemen under the command of Major Stillman and Bailey, which had been gathered in the upper country. They had had no long march to weary them, but were impatient to get a chance at the enemy. They set off as scouts on a dark, threatening morning in May, with orders to coerce the Indians they met into submission. I thought, says the governor in his memoirs, they might discover the enemy, and they did. Black Hawk had been urging the tribes of the Rock River to rejoin him, but had received so little encouragement that he was almost prepared to make peace with the advancing army. He was now a little way up the river with a party of 40 or 50 warriors. A bodyguard selected from his 800 men, who was encamped several miles beyond. As the chief sat at supper on the evening of the 14th of May, he was told that a small party of white horsemen was making camp nearby. The creek on whose banks the Americans had halted was lined with tall willows, which made a good protection for the camp. The vanguard of 2 brigades had stopped, tied their horses to the trees, and begun to build fires for supper when 3 Indians appeared on a height nearly a mile away. It afterwards proved that these Indians were messengers from Black Hawk and were bearing a white flag of truce. The scouts, at sight of the Indians, rushed out and seized them. Black Hawk and his men, watching at a distance, saw their men captured and prepared hastily to meet and attack the whites. The squads of soldiers who had started in the chase were scattered without any regular order along half a mile of the valley. When the foremost of the purpose came upon Black Hawk and his men hidden behind a growth of brush, the savages dashed out upon them with wild war whoops. The soldiers thought that 800 Indians were behind their leader and scattered in every direction. Their officers tried to rally them, but the forces were disorganized. The men leaped on their horses and rode away. The Indians, astonished at this sudden development, feared that they were being led into an ambush, but they pursued the white men, killing those who overtook them. At one of 2 places, companies of soldiers turned and made a gallant fight, but most of them escaped on their swift horses. By 2s and 3s they straggled into the camp at Dixon's Ferry, 25 miles away, with a story of defeat that spread a panic over the whole frontier. The army marched next day to the scene of the surprise, but Black Hawk and his men were gone. It was not thought wise to pursue them farther north without a better supply of provisions. The expected and easy victory had encouraged Black Hawk and had brought many Indians of other tribes to his side. A reign of terror followed Stillman's defeat. Scalping parties organized by Black Hawk covered the frontier, making raids on the exposed northern settlements. Many on both sides lost their lives, for small parties of American settlers made gallant defenses in their scattered villages and held the Indians back. 3 weeks from the time of the first attack, a new army of volunteers, 4,000 strong, took the field. They marched to Dixon's Ferry and then plunged into the wilderness, taking every precaution as they proceeded into the enemy's country to guard against surprise. On the 30th of June, they crossed the Illinois border near the present city of Beloit, Wisconsin, and came upon abandoned camps and other signs of the retreating Indians. The progress through the wilderness of Wisconsin was slow and difficult. Day after day, the troops pushed on, wading up to their armpits in mud and water, or hewing away the trees and underbrush that barred their course. After 3 weeks, they came up with the last of the fugitives, passing through a forest where stands today the city of Madison. They came to the shores of the Wisconsin River, and there they fought the battles of Wisconsin Heights. The loss of life among the Indians was heavy, among the Americans light. During the night after the battle, they startled soldiers sitting in their camp, heard from the direction of the Indian encampment a loud, clear voice speaking in an unknown tongue. They feared that some chief was directing his men to descend upon the camp and make a night attack. After a time, however, the voice ceased and nothing more was thought of the incident. It proved afterwards that this was the voice of an orator sent by Black Hawk to beg for peace. He had used the Winnebago tongue, and as the members of that tribe had left the camp that very day, no one understood him. Thus, the second attempt of Black Hawk to make peace failed. From this time on, the story of the campaign is a tale of restlessness, pursuit, and slaughter of the fugitives. Black Hawk and his starving war party reached the banks of the Mississippi, but an American steamer prevented their crossing into safety. The troops came upon them at a point called Bad Axe, and for 3 hours the bloody conflict raged. The white men lost only 17 men killed and 12 wounded. At least 150 Indians were killed in the battle, and as many more men, women, and children were drowned or shot down in their attempts to escape. Nearly 1,000 Indians had crossed the Mississippi at Rock River 200 miles below. Barely 150 regained the western bank at Bad Axe. General Winfield Scott brought home the remaining troops who were attacked by cholera on the journey and suffered great losses. The Winnebagoes, with whom Black Hawk sought refuge, delivered him over to the Americans, who put him under the guardianship of his former rival, the peace-loving Keokuk. By order of the War Department, the fallen warrior was taken during the time of his captivity on a tour of the country to see in the East the strength of the white man and realize the futility of further resistance by the Indian. On his first trip he went to Washington, was received by President Jackson, and was taken to Philadelphia, New York, up to Hudson, and back by way of the Great Lakes to Rock River, where he was set free. In 1837, Keokuk, who did not dare leave him unwatched in his absence, took him to Washington again with a deputation of Sauk and Fox Indians, and on this trip he went to Boston. The experiences of the savage warrior in this eastern city take us back to the time where Champlain took his Indian host, Darental, to the little settlement in Quebec in 1616 and showed him the civilization of the Frenchman. Nothing could portray better the change in the relations of the white man and the red man in the 200 years that had come between. The Indian delegation was received by the mayor, the aldermen, and the Common Council of Boston and Faneuil Hall. The armories and the Navy Yard were visited to show the military power of Bostonians. A levee was held at Faneuil Hall to receive the ladies who desired to meet the warriors, and on Monday morning, October 30th, 1837, they were formally received in the hall of the House of Representatives by Governor Everett, attended by his staff and other officers. In flowing and graceful language, the governor welcomed the Indians on behalf of the Commonwealth, and addressing them in the Indian style of oratory, the chiefs responded one by one to his words, Black Hawk in a shrill, clear voice that attracted the attention of the audience to the famous veteran warrior. All thanked the governor for his kind words and shook hands with him, expressing their desire for friendship with the white man. The party then adjourned to the Boston Common, where they performed a series of war dances in the presence of an immense crowd, and in the evening they went to the Tremont Theatre to see The Banker of Bogota, which was being played there. With this scene, the picture of the life of the last great Indian warrior of the Lake region ends. Black Hawk returned to his home and died the next year at the age of 71 in a reservation at Des Moines, Iowa, set apart for him and his few remaining followers. The Indians had been humbled and defeated. The Black Hawk War called national attention to the western country. The troops had explored the wilderness, little known to the Americans, and the story of their march into Wisconsin had been published in full in the newspapers of the East. Guidebooks were issued, painting in brilliant colors the charm of the region, and the tide of westward immigration followed the sale of public lands by the government. Northern Illinois gained a large population, and Wisconsin was made a territory within 4 years. The foundation of the Lake States had been laid. The Northwest had been Americanized.